And now, please welcome to the stage, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Thank you. Well, thank you a lot. That's really quite remarkable. So I was just thinking backstage, but I think about what I'm going to talk about really, like right up to the last second of the talk. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to dive into, because I use these talks as an opportunity to dig more deeply into what I've been thinking about. And I'm going to talk to you about this book I wrote, 12 Rules for Life, obviously, but I'm not parroting the book. I'm trying to make what I'm thinking about clearer. I was thinking, I need a little story in my head before I come up for the talk about what exactly it is that I'm going to address. And I thought, I'm going to address the relationship between perception and reality tonight. And I thought, that's a very serious topic, and it's so funny to sit at the back of the stage and think that, and then come out here and get welcomed like that, because they just don't seem to go together. Really, that's what you're here for. You're going to listen to me talk for 70 minutes about, it's a philosophical discussion, really, a psychological discussion as well, about the relationship between perception and reality. And who would have thought that would be like a popular thing, So, but I think it's really something. Yeah. Well, there's obviously a hunger that's been unmet for some reason for serious discourse, and that's great. So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do tonight. So I'm going to stumble around a little bit tonight, I think, because this is a very difficult topic, and I haven't got it completely clear in my head. So hopefully I can make this as coherent as possible. But see, what I've been trying to solve, at least to some degree, is the problem of the relationship between value and reality. We live in a world of value, where things have value. But material reality itself doesn't seem to have any intrinsic value, right? It's there and it's objective. And in some sense, whatever value there is, we attribute to the world. That's one way of looking at it, anyways. And that opens up questions about the reality of value. And it also, so that's one thing I want to address. The other problem I want to address is how it is that perception is even possible, because the world is an insanely complicated place. Like, it's so complicated that it's really beyond comprehension. And so it isn't obvious how it is that you can comprehend it or that you can perceive it, because it's actually it's so complex it's beyond your ability to perceive. So I'm trying to solve two problems at the same time. How in the world do you manage this incredibly difficult job of perception? And what role does value, the idea of value, the idea that one thing is worth more than another, what role does that play in that? You might say, well, why is that so relevant? And, well, it's exactly relevant because of the problem of relevance. You have to assume that one thing is more important than another before you can do anything, because to do something means that you privilege that thing above all the other things that you could be doing. You value it more. And so without imposing a value structure on the world or discovering one within the world, I don't know which of those is true. You can't even act, and you have to act. So you're stuck with value. Let's see if I can make this not pop quite so much. You're stuck with the problem of value. Okay, so we're going to walk through that. I'm going to see if I can untangle that. There's, I guess, a third issue too, which is, given that you have to value things, in order to act, and that you have to act, then what should you value? And how is that related to how you should perceive the world? Okay, so that's the problem space, let's say, that we're going to investigate. And this is related to chapter 10, which is be precise in your speech, which is an attempt in 12 Rules for Life to lay some of this out. So the first thing I want to point out is some peculiarities about the way you perceive the world. So I'm going to tell you a story first about a famous psychological experiment that was run by Dan Simon. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. It's an experiment that has to do with a phenomenon that Simon called change blindness. I don't think he invented the term. I think his supervisor did, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. So what Simon did, he made this video. Most of you have seen it. I think he put 6 people in front of an elevator in a psychology lab, and he had 3 of them dressed in black and 3 of them dressed in white, and the black team had a basketball and the white team had a basketball, and the white team was sort of dancing around and passing the basketball back and forth, and so was the black team. They had their own basketball. And your job was to come into the lab, sit down, watch the video, count the number of times that the white team threw the basketball back and forth. That's all you had to do. Now, so you got to imagine for a minute your state of mind when you do that. So you've come to the lab, you've come to participate in a scientific experiment, you've come to follow instructions, and you've come, at least in principle, to demonstrate that you're capable of doing all those things, right? It might be somewhat intimidating to come into a lab like that, and you want to do a good job. And maybe you want to do a good job because you want to be a competent person. And the reason I'm telling you all that is because you've got to think about why you would follow the instructions. And you do, okay? Because it turns out that the fact that you follow the instructions is very, very important in this particular demonstration. So you sit down, and the video unfolds in front of you. The people in the video are quite large, like they fill the whole screen, so they're not way off in the distance. That's important because of what happens. And so Simon starts the video. It only runs for about 3 minutes, and the white team is moving around, bouncing the basketball and throwing it back and forth. And you're watching it, and you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and you think that you're doing a fine job, and you're trying to do a fine job. And you run out the whole 3 minutes, and the experimenter says, how many times did the white team throw the basketball back and forth? And you say, 16. And he says, correct. And you're thinking, great, I aced that, man. And then he says, well, did you see anything peculiar? And you say, no. What do you mean peculiar? And he says, well, did you see the gorilla? Right. And you say, well, what do you mean? Did I see the gorilla? There was no gorilla. And so Simon says, okay, watch the video again. This time don't count. So he rewinds it, plays it. Like a minute into the video, 3-minute video, this guy comes in from the left of the screen. He's like 6'4". He has a gorilla suit on. He walks right into the middle of the video, right in the center. And he beats his chest for 5 seconds, like gorillas do, at least hypothetically. And then he saunters off. And it's not like he just zips across, man. He saunters out, beats his chest quite confidently, and then wanders off to the side. And about 60% of the people who watch that video don't see the gorilla. And so some of you have watched that video, and maybe you saw the gorilla, maybe you didn't. And then he made a follow-up video for all those people who thought they'd learned their lesson the first time they watched the video. And in this video, the same thing happens, except when the gorilla comes out, now people are primed for that. They catch the gorilla. The curtains behind change from red to gold, and one of the team players leaves. And so, he asks you this time, you're feeling all smart about whether or not you saw anything strange, and you say, yeah, I saw the gorilla. And he rewinds and says, yeah, but did you see the curtain change color? Like the curtain, eh? Not just the curtain, but that. You missed that completely, and you missed the fact that someone left. It's like, so even when you know you're blind, you're still blind. And Simon has done stranger things than that. So one of the experiments he did at Harvard, which was a great experiment, is he put a camera on top of a building. He was filming Harvard Yard, which is the basic central point of the campus. And there's lots of people out there. And so he had an undergraduate going up to a tourist with a map and ask for directions. Okay, so imagine you've got your undergraduate here, tourist there, asking directions with the map. Now over here, there are 2 workmen, and they're holding a door like this. So here's the door. You can't see the workmen, right? Because the door covers them. There's one at the front, one at the back. And so undergraduate, tourist, workman. They walk right between the tourist and the undergraduate. And then the undergraduate who's asking for directions grabs the door and keeps on walking. And one of the workmen grabs the map and stands there. So basically what he's done is swapped people. And about 60% of the tourists who are being asked for directions don't notice that they're now talking to a different person. Right? So that's how blind you are. And you are staggeringly blind. It's amazing that you can make it in the world at all. In fact, most of what you see when you look at the world is actually your memory and not the world, because your brain uses your memory of things to fill in what you don't see. And as we've already demonstrated, because you didn't see the gorilla, God only knows what you're missing. And that's the critical issue with regards to that experiment. Is like, who knows what you're missing? And the thing that's so crucial, here's where value plays into it. And this is why I made a case out of you following instructions. It's like, well, why didn't you see the gorilla? And the answer is, well, you were counting the basketballs. And then the question is, well, why were you counting the basketballs? And the answer to that is because you were following instructions. And then the question is, well, why were you following instructions instead of paying attention, let's say, to the gorilla, which seems more relevant? You say, well, why were you following instructions anyways? Well, you're trying to be a good experimental subject, I guess. Maybe you're trying not to look stupid. You're trying to do the task properly. Well, why is that? Well, maybe you want to demonstrate that you're a competent person. It's like, well, why is that so important to you? You see, the reason I'm asking all these questions is because the way that your perception was structured in that experiment is dependent on all the values that you brought to the perceptual act in that experiment. All those things were focusing your attention on what it was that you focused on. And that was the balls and not the gorilla. And those are all issues of value. You know, the only reason that you counted the balls was because you thought that was the most important thing to do in that circumstance. So that was what you valued above all else in that circumstance. And so what that shows is that what you value determines what you see. Now, I should just stand here and repeat that phrase to you for the next hour and then leave. Right? Because it's so important, that it's so mind-boggling that, I mean, this experiment was a bombshell in psychology for a whole bunch of reasons, but it was also a popular bombshell because how many of you have seen that video? You know, oh yeah, it's hordes of you, right? It's like, how many other psychology experiment videos have you watched? It's like 0. This one everyone has watched, and no other ones have been watched at all by anyone ever. And so that just shows you how absolutely mind-boggling this is, although it's so shocking that it can be the case, but it's actually even more shocking than just the revelation that you're blind. Because that's bad enough, because you think, of course I'd see the damn gorilla. It's like, no, you wouldn't. But that isn't even the thing that's most mind-boggling about it. What's most mind-boggling in it about it is that it was the best demonstration that psychologists had ever managed in some sense, about the structure of perception, but even more importantly, about the fact that your perception is conditioned by your values. And so we're going to delve into that a little bit. Because the thing is, one of the things you might ask yourself is, if you miss the gorilla, what else are you missing? And then you might ask yourself, well, are you missing something in your life? And you know, the answer to that is often yes. And then the question arises, well, if you're missing something in your life, maybe you're aiming at the wrong thing. Maybe you're valuing the wrong thing. So you're blind to what you need. And the world is a very complicated place, and there's lots in it. And if you're missing something important, it might be because you're not aiming at the right thing. And it really might be that. And that's the thing that's so deadly about that experiment. Now, that isn't the only thing. That experiment isn't the only experiment that demonstrates this sort of thing. There's convergent evidence supporting this line of thinking from all sorts of disparate areas of psychology of perception. So, another piece of evidence is this. You have limited perceptual resources. And so, especially for vision, because vision is really, really neurally intensive. So you mostly, when you look at the world, you mostly use the center of your eye. It's called the fovea, and it's the high-resolution part of your eye. Now, you know the difference between a high-resolution and a low-resolution image. A high-resolution image has lots of detail. A low-resolution image has less detail. And so, if you look straight ahead, like if I look at maybe I'll look at you, so I can see your face quite clearly. I know you have a face, but I can't see it. You're just a blur. I can just see the fact that your face is light and that your shirt is dark. I can't see you people at all. I know you're there. I'm not letting my eyes move, but I really can't see you people at all either. So my visual space is limited to about that much. And the part that's sharp enough to actually see a face is limited to your face, because I can tell you have eyes, especially if you move them, because I'm pretty good at detecting motion in my periphery, but I can't tell anything else about you. I think your shirt's blue, I think it is. So anyways, now, each of the neurons, each of the cells in the fovea, which is the high-resolution part, are connected to 10,000 cells in the primary visual cortex, and then they're connected to, well, infinite numbers of cells virtually above that. And the reason I'm telling you that is because foveal tissue is neurally expensive. And so if I needed my whole visual field to be as high resolution as my fovea, then I'd have to have a head like an alien. And that would be ugly. So what we do is we make the most of what we have, and we dart our eyes out around all the time. So we're just flicking our eyes around like mad, taking snapshots of things and stitching them together very quickly. And it gives us the illusion that we have a complete field of vision. It's not just an illusion, because obviously you can walk across the street most of the time without being hit by anything that's moving too quickly. So it suffices to keep you alive, but there's way less of it there than you think. Now, what I see in high resolution, so what I'm using my valuable neurological resources for, is what I decide is important. And you can tell what I decide is important by the fact that I'm looking at it, right? I'm choosing to point my eyes at something of value. Well, why else would I bother pointing my eyes there? The mere fact that I'm doing that is also an indication that I'm organizing my perception with a value structure. And here's something that's really cool about people, is because we want to look at what's valuable, right? That just seems kind of obvious. Why look at what isn't valuable when you could look at what's valuable? Well, so how do you infer what's valuable? Well, sometimes through painful learning. You learn what's valuable and what isn't. But there's other tricks that we acquired to figure out what's valuable too. So here's something cool about your eyes. So you have a pupil, and then you have an iris around that that's colorful. Then you have whites around that, right? But you're weird that way because animals don't have that. Even higher primates, the ones that are most akin to us biologically, they don't have that. We do, and the reason for that is I want to see where you point your eyes. And if your iris is standing out on a white background, I can really tell where your eyes are pointed. And we're unbelievably good at figuring out where people point their eyes. And in fact, when we interact with other people, pretty much all we do is look at their eyes. Now, it isn't all we do, because we look at their whole face, because they're signaling emotions with their face. We're really trying to figure out what all these other people that we're looking to are up to. But part of the way that we figure out what they're up to is by inferring what they think is valuable. And the way that we infer what they think is valuable is by watching where they point their eyes. And people are really good at pointing. Like, if I pointed something, which is like an extension of my vision, if you have any sense, you don't look at my finger, you look at what I'm pointing at. Now, an animal will look at your finger, because it just doesn't get the whole there's something out there thing, which is part of the reason that animals can't speak, because the pointing gesture is prototypical speech. It means signifies an object of value, and often that object of value would have a name. So we point with our eyes at things of value. You can track people like this. So there's a famous social psychological experiment. It's kind of a casual experiment. So imagine that you're the experimenter. This was done decades ago. And all you do is decide to stand on the corner and look up, like this. It's on a busy street. And somebody walks by, and they're kind of thinking that you'll look at them because they're important too, but you don't. You just keep looking up. And they look at you, and they look up, and they look at you again, and they look up, and they think, well, unless there's something wrong with you, there must be something up there, because why would you be standing there looking otherwise? And so they feel that there must be something important up there, and so then they'll look. And they'll look at you to see what's going on. And then, of course, there's two of you looking now, and so whatever's up there must really be worth looking at, and so then the next person will come around and look too, and soon you get a crowd of people. So if you're bored one day, and maybe you're smoking too much pot and want to do something stupid, you can run that little experiment on the corner, you know. So, but there's something deep about that too, because this is how we infer the motivation of other people. This is how we understand people, is we figure out what the hell they're pointing at. And that helps us infer their value structure. And if I can infer your value structure, if I know what you find is important, then I can run you as a simulation on my biological platform, and I can infer what you're thinking and feeling. And that's how we understand each other. That's how it works. We actually use our body as a computational platform to run simulations of other people. And we do that by inferring their value structure. We do that by looking at what they're looking by looking at what they're looking at, by trying to understand what they think is important. That's what you do in a movie, right? You go to a movie. What the hell are you doing in a movie? Anyways, well, it's entertaining. Well, that's not the question. The question is, why is it entertaining? Why is it so important that you will line up and pay to watch it? Like that's really worth thinking about, because it's strange behavior. You find it's so useful to you that you find it intrinsically meaningful. So much so that you'll pay for it. Well, unless, what are you, just twiddling your thumbs? Is it just like useless activity, or are you doing something important? Well, you're doing something important. You're going to what's essentially a literary, what would you call literary experience, because it's a story. And you're locking yourself on the protagonist and the other characters, and you're adopting their value structure, and you're embodying that, and you experience all the emotions and all the motivations for no risk to yourself except the $14 that you pay to be admitted to the theater, and you gain all that experience vicariously. And that's part of how you understand the world, and we're doing that with each other all the time. One of the things we're trying to do is to watch each other to figure out what's important to the other person, so that we can figure out what they're up to, so that we can learn what's important for us, so that we can orient ourselves properly in the world. It's of crucial importance. It's partly why stories are so important to kids, for example. You can teach kids almost anything with a story. They'll come running up to you with a book and say, read me a story, read me a story. Maybe the same story 50 times while they're trying to understand it. That's how important it is. It's absolutely crucial. And maybe it's crucial so you can distinguish the gorillas from the basketballs, something like that. Okay, so that's another piece of evidence that we use our value structures to perceive the world. So that's two pieces of evidence. Here's another way of looking at it. So if I'm looking at this landscape, let's say, what I see in front of me is going to depend on what I decide to do. So now it's not only what I see, and this is where it gets a little bit more sophisticated. It's not only what I see, it's what I experience. It's broader than perception. And with experience, I would say what motivates me, and also what I experience emotionally. So here's a nice way of understanding emotions. It's a very simple way, and of the relationship with perception. So let's say I need to go over off stage on that side of the stage. And so if I'm standing here, I have a clear path right to the other side of the stage. And that's actually going to have a small effect on my mood, because once I decide that going to the other side of the stage is the valuable thing to do, when I see a clear path in front of me, that produces a little burst of positive emotion. And the reason for that is that people experience positive emotion in relationship to the likelihood that they're going to attain a valued goal. This is also something that's worth thinking about, because you tend to think, well, you experience positive emotion when you get something you want. It's like, well, wait a second. It's not so simple. I mean, let's say you want to have a promotion at work. And so you get the promotion. Maybe have a party about that, but what happens the next day? It's like, well, you're nervous about it, right? Because you're not who you were, and now you have these new responsibilities. So it's not like you're on cloud 9 permanently, or maybe you graduate from high school and you're happy about that, but the next day, man, you've got a new set of problems. The same if you graduate from university. Whenever you hit a milestone in your life, it's not like you're there and that's that. So that the pleasure in the attainment of a goal can be quite fleeting, because then you need another goal. And even the fact that you need another goal after attaining that goal can be a problem. Like, you might be depressed after graduating from high school because you don't know what to do next. That happens to people all the time. So it turns out technically that the form of positive emotion, positive meaning, that's more reliable than that is the positive emotion that's associated with the feeling that you're attaining a valuable goal. Now that's worth thinking about too, because what it means is that if you want the meaning in life that's positively engaging, then you have to be pursuing a valuable goal. And then we can tie that back to the discussion at the beginning. It's like, the way the world manifests itself to you depends on your aim. Okay, and then if you're going to experience positive emotion in the world, you have to have a valuable aim. And then there's a corollary to that too, which is, the more valuable your aim, the more positive emotion you experience while you're moving towards it. And so what that would imply, at least in part, is you want to have the most valuable aim possible. That's what it seems to me. So then the question is, well, what's the most valuable aim possible? Okay, so that's where we'll go next. But anyways, one of the consequences of that, even in the microcosm, let's say, is that if you see a clear pathway to a partial goal, that gives you a little boost of positive emotion. Now, positive emotion is also associated with the act of moving forward. And that's how your emotions are tied to your body. So if you're pursuing something of value and you have positive emotion, then you have to pursue it. You're moving ahead, That's what you say when someone says how you're doing. I'm moving ahead in life. That's a positive thing to say, right? I'm getting ahead. That's a positive thing as well. It's like climbing uphill. That's a positive thing as well. So we know that approaching something, moving forward, is associated with positive emotion. Stopping, it's like that's what happens when something happens that you don't expect. So you're moving ahead towards a goal, and something you don't expect happens, or a threat, something dangerous, you stop. That's anxiety, technically speaking. Anxiety stops you, because you get anxious when you don't know what's going on. You get anxious when you don't know if the path in front of you is clear anymore. And you should stop because you don't know what's going to happen. So and then to retreat, that's associated, say, with, escaping from pain. So you basically have three modes of being. You move ahead, that's positive. You stop, and you get out of there. And that's your emotional structure. And so if you see a pathway in front of you that's clear to something you value, then that puts a little positive emotion in your step, and you move forward forthrightly. Now, if I'm standing here, the situation is a little more complicated, because there are things in the way. And that's actually, in some sense, how I see them. Like, obviously, that's a chair, and that's a little stool. And you might say, well, that's what those things are. It's like, yeah, it's not so simple exactly. What they are for me right now is minor league obstacles in the pathway to my goal. And so they're tinged with a little bit of negative emotion. Now, not too much, because I know I can just do this, right? So I can solve the problem that those obstacles constitute, and so they don't bother me very much. One of the things that I've been suggesting to people is that, it's become a bit of a meme, is that you should clean up your room. And that's caught on. Like, what the hell? Why did that catch on? It's not like everyone hasn't told you that since you were like 1, So it's a funny thing, but there's deep reasons for it. It's like, your room, let's say you're in your room, I don't know, let's say you're in your room 2 hours a day, just for the sake of argument. And so we can do a little math there. Let's do a little bit of math. So that's 14 hours a week. So that's one day in your life. Let's say you're awake for and doing something that isn't mandatory 14 hours a day. So it's 1/7 of your life. And so in a year, that would be 40, 50 days. 2 months. You're in your room for 2 months every year. So that's 1/7 of your life. And so it's not really your room, it's really 1/7 of your life. Right? And you can think about it as a material place that you inhabit. It is that, but that's not all it is. It's a place that your experience is localized for 1/7 of your life. And you might think, well, how do you want that experience to lay itself out? It's like, Well, you want the place to be like an unruly hellhole? So imagine that you have things to do in there, right? And you have things to do in there. Maybe you have work to do. Maybe you have thinking to do. Maybe you have to get dressed so that you can present yourself to the world. Maybe you have to sleep. I don't know, whatever it is that you're doing in your room. Maybe you have playing on your computer or communicating with people. Let's assume some of that is useful. So, well, how do you want to organize that? And the answer is you want to organize it beautifully and efficiently. Because if you do that, then a good proportion of the 1/7 of your life that you're spending in there is going to be of high quality. And so if you organize that room, at least make it clean, let's say, that's the minimum starting place, make it clean, then the pathway to all those things that you have to do in that room that are important becomes clear, and then when you walk into the room, you're going to feel positive emotion instead of negative emotion. You know this perfectly well. You know it perfectly well. You walk into your room, there's your desk, and there's a bunch of things on there, stacks of paper, and you haven't looked at them for like 3 months, and some of them are like tax bills, phone bills, correspondence you haven't caught up with, and God only knows what, and some of those bills are like older than they should be, and you think those are just stacks of papers, and of course they're not. They're not stacks of paper at all, except in the most trivial sense, and you're so annoyed with yourself and so terrified of them that when you walk into your room, you won't even look at them. Right? You'll make a concerted effort not to look at your desk. And if your room gets cluttered enough, and if your life gets cluttered enough, then everything around you will be like that. It's all tangled up pathways to hell, essentially, distributed randomly. Really, I'm serious about this. Distributed sort of randomly through your house. And then how in the world are you going to have a reasonable, productive, meaningful, beautiful experience if that's how you set up your environment? And it's not your environment. It's an extension of you. You can't think of it any more clearly than that. So, and what the behavioral psychologists know perfectly well, one of the things you could do if you want to get people to start organizing themselves mentally is to do something like organize their desk. And I know some of you have idiosyncratically cluttered desks and you know where everything is, and that's your weird little style. And maybe that works for you, although probably mostly it's rationalization and BS. But maybe it works for you. That's just the way I do it. It's like, yeah, right. But if you take a shot at organizing that, making the pathways clear, then things clear up in front of you, and the probability that when you walk into your room, it's going to welcome you. You think, well, that's a pretty weird way of looking at it. Your room doesn't really welcome you. It's like, really? You've never been in a room that's hostile to you. It's just because you're not paying any attention. I'm sure there's plenty of you in this auditorium who don't like certain rooms in their house, don't like going into them, because God only knows what's in there. And you can feel that emanating from those places where you've stored the 150,000 decisions that you should have made in your life that you didn't make, in the forms of stacks of things that you should have attended 2 years ago. If you don't think that has any effect on you, you've just dulled your senses to the point where you don't notice, because it certainly has an effect on you. And you might also think, well, maybe you not only want to clean up your room, which is something, you want to make it beautiful. That would be something even greater, something I didn't write about in 12 Rules for Life. It'll probably be in the next book. It's like you could take it to the next step. You could not only set up your room so that you knew where your clothes were, and you knew why you were wearing them, and you knew who you were going to be when you wore them, and you set up the place that you sleep so that when you went to sleep, you slept, so that when you woke up in the morning, like you were refreshed and ready to take on the world. And so that the whole place was pristine and it reflected your discipline, and then you could make the bloody place beautiful because you would learn how to do that. You might think, well, it's just my room. It's like, you're wealthy, man. It hasn't been very long. It hasn't been very long at all in the history of the world that people had their own room. It's a bloody miracle that you have that, especially with the kind of rooms we have now. And that's the case even if you live in, maybe not the most desirable part of town. You can still make that little area that you're responsible for something bloody pristine and perfect. And that would teach you how to make a little corner of the world pristine and perfect, and that would help you be that way. And then you being that way and your room being that way would be a hint to your family, although they might object like mad when they figure out what you're up to, So, and then maybe from there you could start to branch that out into the other things that you're doing. These are not trivial issues. They're very, very fundamental issues. And so you want to make the room that you inhabit the vast majority of the time into a microcosm of the way that you would like things to be. It's an unbelievably useful exercise, and what's so cool about it is you can just do it, right? It's right there in front of you. There's absolutely nothing stopping you except your contempt for what you have. And that's something you should just dispense with entirely because, well, it's not helpful. It's not helpful. It's not accurate. It's not helpful. It's not psychologically useful. It's counterproductive. It's not good. It's not good. Okay, so now let's go into this a little bit more deeply. So one of the things I do with my students when I'm feeling like torturing them is asking them why they're in class. For example, say they're trying to do an assignment. Say, well, why do you care if you do this assignment? Usually you can get about 5 answers out of people with this line of questioning before they run out of answers. And then they're not happy that you keep questioning them because it's rude. It's like, well, why do you care about the assignment? It's like, well, I need to hand in the assignment to get a good grade in the course. Well, why do you care about whether or not you get a good grade in the course? Well, I need to finish off this year at university. Oh, why do you need to do that? Well, I need to graduate and have a degree. Well, why do you need to do that? It's like, well, because I need to get a job and support myself. Well, you get the basic idea. Why do you need to do that? It's, well, I want to have a career and maybe I want to have a family. It's like, okay, well, why do you need to do that? You can keep asking that question. Now, what I'm pointing out here is something that's sort of analogous to what I was pointing out when I was outlining why you went to the lab to begin with and followed the instructions, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons that are determining your behavior. And so when you do something like, well, maybe you're going to the library, and so you have to cross the street. And you have to cross the street to get to the library, and you have to get to the library to pick up a book, and you have to pick up a book to study, and you need to study to pass the exam, and then that nests inside all of those other plans that I just described. So not only do you have an aim, let's say, but you have an aim that's nested inside a bunch of other aims. And so that's how you focus your attention on the world. Is I need to cross the street because I need to go to the library, because I need to get a book, because I need to study, because I need to pass the exam, because I need to pass the course, because I need to get the degree so that I can get a job, so that I can take my place in the community. And what you notice is that with each of those questions, the area that your aim covers in terms of time and space, that's the right way of thinking about it, gets bigger, right? Because crossing the street, that's like a 5-second thing, and going to the library to get a book, maybe that's like a 1-hour thing, and then studying is a 1-week thing, your course is a 1-month thing or a 3-month thing. With each of those successive moves outward, you're describing a series of aims that cover a larger area of space and time. So you can think about that as your map of space and time. And that's a useful map because you live in space and time, and so you should map it. And that's what you do with your value structure, because all of that's value, right? It's all assumption about what it is that's necessary to do. So then the question is, well, what is it necessary to do? How far out can you push that set of assumptions? It's like, well, we've kind of pushed it out to, well, I want to be a productive person and I want to have a family, okay? Well, why? Well, maybe people stop there because they think, well, that's self-evident. It's something like that. It collapses into self-evidence, and so it's rude to push it. It's like, well, it does and it doesn't. It's like, well, because you might ask, well, okay, let's say you're going to have a career and a family. Is there a map in which that should be embedded? And then the question would be, well, if you're going to have a career and a family, how should you go about doing that in the best possible way? Because that would be the next question. And, at some point, you're going to run out of ability to question. You're going to hit the ultimate ends of the map, I would say. What seems to happen, as far as I can tell, is that when you get out that far in the line of ethical questioning, you start to enter the domain of something like a story. Because you don't have an explicit answer anymore. You say, well, I'm going to have a family and I'm going to have a career. It's like, well, why are you going to do that? And why is that an important thing to do? Or how would you do that if you did it right? And then what you do, at some point when you run out of explicit answers, you start thinking about examples. Like you might think, well, that's what people have always done. That's what people I admire have done. You know, that's what my father did, or that's what my grandfather did. Or I knew people who took real pride in their work, and that's how I want to conduct myself. So you start to devolve, what would you say, your explicit presuppositions start to shadow into something like stories. And so that's where our explicit knowledge meets the domain of the great story. So, what's the great story? What's all that nested in? This is where the discussion gets more complicated. And this is where I'm going to have to dig to get this right. I've been trying to understand what it means to act ethically. You know, that starting with the presupposition that actually does mean something. So, you know, in our modern world, people tend towards a kind of moral relativism. They make the proposition that there's many, many ethical systems, and it's very difficult to adjudicate between them. And maybe there's no ethical system that has predominance over any other ethical system, something like that. And I don't buy that. I don't think it's true at all. I think that there's a very limited number of ways that you can make your way through the world properly, and that severely constrains the value system that you have to adopt. Let's say, well, if you want to have a family, and you want to do that properly, let's say, then how might you go about doing that? Well, let's see if we can take that apart a little bit. Let's see if I can use this as a means of example. Okay, so imagine that you want to be a good father. And so then imagine that one of the things that a good father does is teach his children how to behave properly. So that's rule number 5 in my book, right? Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. So I'm going to give you a sophisticated example about how you might teach your children to behave properly. And that would be part of the structure in which being a good parent would be nested. Okay, so I'll tell you a little story about a hockey game I watched once. It was a hockey game that my son was involved in. He was a pretty decent hockey player. He was only about 13 when this was happening. We used to go watch him play in this little neighborhood league. And he was a good hockey player, but he wasn't the best hockey player on his team. There was this other kid that was clearly the star. And we were watching them in this league championship game. And, you know, it was a really well-fought game between well-matched teams. So that's a good thing, right? Generally, if you want to go watch a sports game, weirdly enough, you want to see a well-fought game between well-matched teams. You don't want to see one team just stomp the hell out of the other, you know, and have the game be 18-1. That's not fun. You want to see the struggle unfold in a relatively matched manner. It's kind of interesting because it's not obvious why you wouldn't want to see, you know, one team just, you know, beat to death, so to speak, by the other. Maybe you could take some gratification in that, but if you have any sense, you don't. You want to see the teams struggle against each other. You want the outcome to be hard enough so that it's uncertain, and you want to see the spectacle unfold in real time. And so that's what was happening. So it was a really good game. And then in the last 6-7 seconds of the game, real cliffhanger or something like that, last 6 or 7 seconds, one of the kids from the opposing team zipped down ice and made a beautiful play and scored. And the buzzer went, and that was the end of the game. And everybody clapped, and, you know, the kids lined up and shook each other's hands. But the star on my son's team, he was not happy. And he was not happy. He was acting out the proposition that he had been wronged. And so he got off the ice, and he took his hockey stick, and he smashed it on the cement, and he was having a little tantrum, you know, and which was pretty pathetic. And his father, seriously, man, like, what the hell? And so, and then his father came rushing up, and his father was a preposterous idiot, and he basically agreed with his son. He said, yeah, you were robbed, and you played such a spectacular game, you should have won, the referees took it away from you, and, you know, he watched his son misbehave like a 2-year-old, and then he rewarded him for it and reinforced it. It's like, well, one of the things that we could hypothesize is that's not a good way to be a good father. To be a good parent, for that matter, is that in some manner he was damaging his son. And so, and he paid for it. Like, I knew the guy a bit, and I watched how he conducted himself, and the chickens eventually came home to roost, as they inevitably do. And so, you know, and so, okay, but what was the problem here exactly? It's not so easy to take apart. So the thing about his son was he was the best hockey player on the team. And so, he was trying to win the game, because that's what you're supposed to do, is try to win a game. And so, if you're the best hockey player on the team, well, that's a kind of victory, right? And if you're trying to win, well, that's what you should be doing. And if you don't win, then why not be upset about it? Because after all, what you're trying to do is win. And so, but you know, all of you know, even though in your weaker moments you might act like that kid's father, you know that that's not good. It's like, why? Why? What exactly is going on? And you might say to your kid, well, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. And your kid thinks, what do you mean by that? And you say, well, I don't know, but it's the right way to behave. And it's like, yeah, you don't know, but it is the right way to behave. And so I can tell you why it's the right way to behave, I think. And so, and this goes along with just chapter 5. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. So imagine this. So what is it exactly that you're trying to do when you want your kid to win? That's, first of all, you got to think about what do you mean by win. We already decided you don't mean stomp your enemy 18-0 in the hockey arena, because there's something about that that's just not exactly right. Okay, so what do you mean? Do you mean win this game? Well, no, you don't exactly mean that, because life isn't a game, right? It's a sequence of games. And not only that, it's a sequence of different games. Right, I mean, let's say you're going to be a pro hockey player, you're not, so you might as well just give up on that, because it's just not going to happen. But even if it does happen, it's still a sequence of games. It's not one game, it's a sequence of games. But if you're a typical person, and even if you're a pro hockey player, hockey is just one of the many games you're going to play. And you're going to play those games with the same people often over and over and over and over. And so then you might say, well, the rules that govern the probability that you'll win a set of games isn't the same as the rule that governs whether or not you win one. And you should never compromise your ability to prevail in a set of games for the purpose of winning a single game. And so when you tell a kid, you should be a good sport, kid, what you're saying is, look, that was a game, and as a single game, it has some import, and it's up to you to try to win, because you're no fun to play with unless you try to win. But this game is only part of a much bigger thing. And you're not trying to win in this at the cost of the much bigger thing. That would be foolish. And so what you actually want to do is conduct yourself in the game in a variety of ways that maximizes the value of the whole set. So you might say, well, let's say you're on a team. Pass the damn puck now and then. Why? Well, because you've got teammates. And maybe your whole team would be better if you helped develop them. So, and maybe you could be the star. You should try to be the best player on the team, but at the same time, you should get the whole team better. So, spend 30% of your time passing the damn puck to some other kid. So, and then, well, that's also going to show all the other kids that you're someone who's worthy of being on the team. That's a really important thing, because you're going to be on a lot of teams. And then, as well, if you conduct yourself properly while you're playing a game and people observe that, then they're going to invite you to play a bunch of other games. And that's really what you want for your kids at school, right? If you think about it. You don't want them to be the best at a game. You want the probability that people will invite them throughout their life to play a whole series of interesting games to be absolutely maximized. Because then they never lack opportunity. The whole world opens itself up to them. And so what you're saying when you say it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game, is conduct yourself so that you have the highest probability of prevailing across the widest possible set of games. And there's an ethic there. And there's a real ethic there. It's real, because it is really the case that life is a set of games. a very large set of games. And it really is the case that there's a way of playing a set of games that maximizes the probability that you'll be successful at the largest number of games. And it's a very sophisticated ethic. It's like, and so I can develop that a little bit. It's like now you're trying to figure out how to conduct yourself in the world. You're going back to what's the outside of the value structure. How are you going to be a good parent? You're going to teach your kid how to play properly in the world. You have to know how to play properly in the world to do that, so that's going to go along with it. It's like, well, how else might that outside ethical structure be parameterized? Let's say, well, you want to play the game so that you take care of yourself, because you need to take care of yourself, or someone else has to, which doesn't seem like a great deal. So you have to take care of yourself, and that's hard. You know, there's things you need. You're a complicated thing to propagate across time, right? So you have to take care of yourself, but you have to take care of yourself in a way that works today, that doesn't interfere with tomorrow, and so that today and tomorrow don't interfere with next week, and so that today, tomorrow, and next week don't interfere with next month and next year, because you're not just taking care of yourself, you're taking care of the set of your possible future selves, and that's way more complicated and difficult. And so you're parameterizing what you have to do. There's an ethic in that, but it's more stringent than that, because no man is an island, as they say, and so it isn't that you just have to take care of yourself, you have to take care of yourself and your family. You have to do that in a way so that there's no interference between the two of you, and so that it propagates across time. So that's really difficult. And then you have to take care of yourself and your family in a way that maximally benefits the community. And so that makes it even harder. And there's no reason not to aim at that, because we've been talking about what it is that you should aim at. It's like, well, you might as well aim at that, because there isn't anything better that you can aim at. And we already decided, at least to some degree, that the way the world manifests itself to you is dependent on what you aim at, and that you should aim at the best possible thing. And so now we're trying to figure out what the best possible thing is. There's a hypothesis there too, which is the more you're willing to aim at the best possible thing, the better the world that reveals itself to you is. And you know, you kind of know that. I think you kind of know that already. I would say part of the reason that you know that implicitly, you know that in the same way that you admire someone who's a good sport. Because you admire that. Even if you watch pro sports, of course you admire the people with skills. There's no doubt about that, and you should, because they're supposed to develop their skills. But the athlete who's top form and who's a what would you say, who's a mature and honorable player, like those are the people that shine above everyone else. They have the skill, but they have the nobility of character. And you put those two things together and you think, well, there's an athlete. Like, there's a role model for young people as well. So it's not just that they can play the game superbly, although they can. It's that they play the set of games superbly. And you know, you see that in athletes who have a real stellar reputation, let's say. Stellar like a star, because that refers to star. And of course, the star is something that you have to lift up your eyes above the earth to see, and to look out into heaven, into a transcendent space, into something that twinkles in the darkness, a source of light. And all of that metaphor is part of what you use when you describe someone as a star. And it's because you know implicitly that they're acting out this ethic that's part and parcel of how you set the world straight. So that's quite remarkable. That's all quite, and I think this is, like, I mean, this all stems, at least to some degree, out of the gorilla experiment, right? It's like, well, why is it that you saw what you saw? Well, it depends on what you aim at. It's like, okay, now that we've started figuring out that what we see and what we emotionally experience is associated with what we aim at, then we can start figuring out just exactly what we should aim at. And so here's another thought, and I think it's a worthwhile one. We'll do two things. We'll follow up this thought, and then we'll talk about how you can get your aim straight. Here's the thought. So I thought a lot about the idea of meaning in life. The first book I wrote was called Maps of Meaning, in fact, and it was an attempt to lay out the structure of meaning, assuming that such a thing existed. And I derived some propositions as a consequence of writing that book. It's a very serious book. It's out in audio form now. In case you're interested, it came out about 3 days ago. And so it's a hard book, but I think it's a lot easier to understand in its spoken form, because I could add the proper intonations to the complex sentences and add the melody to the writing. And so if you like 12 Rules for Life, and if you're interested in what I'm talking about tonight, then you can give it a shot. It's about 50 hours long, I think, in the spoken form. So it's very demanding, but it'll take you places that are very much worth going. Like, seriously, at least they'd be very much worth going as far as I've been concerned. And I've been basing the lectures that I've been doing for 30 years on that book, and the people that I brought along on the journey that constitutes the lecture seem to think that it's worthwhile as well. So you can give it a shot, and it's a study of value, it's a study of meaning. There's a set of propositions embedded in it that are also embedded in 12 Rules for Life, and one of the propositions is that life is intrinsically and ineradicably meaningful, but the ineradicable meaning is negative. It's that life is suffering. People are limited and mortal. We all die. Life has got a tragic element that there's no arguing yourself out of. And so when people say, is life meaningful, that isn't what they mean. Because the negative part of life is right there, and you're going to experience it. Whether you believe it or not, or whether you're skeptical of meaning or not, has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to suffer pain and be anxious. That's going to happen regardless of your rationalizations and your thinking. So you're stuck with that, and you could consider that in some sense a fundamental reality. And I would say most transcendent religious systems make exactly that claim. So Judaism, of course, concentrates on the tragedy of the past. Now, I'm not saying this is all these religious systems concentrate on, and one of the first noble truths of Buddhism is that life is suffering, and then, of course, there's Christianity, and you're all familiar with the central symbolic figure in Christianity, which is the crucifix, which is, and if that isn't a representation of suffering, then you're not paying attention to the religion, because that's obviously what it is. In fact, it's the worst kind of suffering, because here's the worst kind of suffering. I mean, you suffer physically and mentally, right? But the reason you suffer is because people betrayed you, and they betray you despite the fact that you're innocent. So not only is it suffering, it is the worst suffering, which makes it archetypal in some sense. It makes it a kind of suffering that can't be exceeded. So that's why that symbol has such, it's one of many reasons that that symbol has such power. It's like, okay, so that's the bottom line. That's the baseline structure of reality, let's say. You think, well, God, that's so pessimistic. It's like, yeah, that's for sure. But well, it is. It's unbelievably pessimistic. But the thing is that you can't get to what you need to get to until you get to what you can barely tolerate. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you all know, and I think part of the reason perhaps that you're here is because I've been talking about these sorts of things in my lectures and my books, and I'm not trying to pull any punches. Like, I do believe that everyone knows that the claim that life is suffering, and that it's tainted by malevolence, by the way, which even makes it worse, right? It's not just suffering, it's not just the fact that life is tragic. That's bad enough. But it's made worse by the fact that no matter how bad things are, you can do something stupid to make them worse, and you probably not only will, but have, right? And you all know that, because you know perfectly well that when you're miserable, I mean, I know terrible things can just sort of happen randomly, and I understand that perfectly well. But you also know that many of the most miserable moments in your life, and no doubt there has been many of them, you are accompanied by this sense that you knew bloody well when you were getting into it, you weren't smart enough to stop it. Or maybe you even facilitated it. Or maybe you even facilitated it knowing that suffering was going to be the outcome and saying, well, to hell with it, I'm going to do it anyways. And so, or maybe you've been betrayed by someone, because that happens very often, or maybe you betrayed someone, or you act deceitfully or immorally, by your own moral standards, by the way, and so nothing's so bad that you can't make it worse. Right, and so it's not just that life is tragic, it's that it's also touched with malevolence, and that definitely makes it worse. And so that's your starting point. It's like, okay, so that's about as pessimistic as it gets. And you can really delve into that. You can look at, I've studied totalitarian brutality for 40 years, I guess, and I was a clinical psychologist, so I still am, but I've done thousands of hours of clinical work, and I've seen some pretty nasty things. And of course, studied some things that were perhaps even worse. And so, it is definitely the case that people can make the mere tragedy of their life into something very much approximating hell. Some of you are probably from families who've done exactly that, or maybe you're in a family right now that's doing exactly that. It's like, so, and that takes a bad thing and makes it unbearable. You know, you can think, sometimes imagine people around the deathbed of a family member, right? And there's all sorts of unresolved family conflict. And so it isn't bad enough that the person's laying there gasping out their last breath, but everybody in the room is hostile, and let's say they're also arguing. Because that's certainly a good time to have an argument, and it certainly happens plenty. And so you can take something that's pretty damn bad, and then you can turn it into hell. And so that's life. You think, well, oh man, that's pessimistic. It's like, yes, good. It means we've got to the bottom of things, and that's a place that you can start building. You say, all right, fair enough. It's like, life can be like that. And so what that means is that you need a reason to, you need a reason when things aren't good. You need a reason to get out of bed in the morning. You need a reason to move forward, despite the fact that life is essentially tragic and that it's tainted by malevolence. And the question is there anything that's of sufficient grandeur, let's say, or sufficient nobility, or sufficient solidity to be of aid to you when you're faced with the tragic malevolence of life? And I think the answer to that is yes. And that's why this isn't pessimistic, because if you could pose the worst possible question, but then you can answer it with the proper answer, then the question's no longer so bad. Carl Jung said, in sterquilinis infinitur. It's Latin. It means that which you most want will be found where you least want to look. Man, that's a smart idea. And it actually happens to be, well, you've already looked where it was easy to look. You always looked where you wanted to look. Maybe it's time to look where you don't want to look. And that's really for sure. It's like, well, we just look where we don't want to look in this conversation at the darkest part of life. It's like, well, are we up to it? Say that's the fundamental preconditions of life. Yes, it is. Are we up to it? Well, the answer to that seems to be yes, as a matter of fact, that no matter how difficult life is, and no matter how tragic the conditions, or no matter even the fact that it's made worse by the malevolence of the human spirit, let's say, we're actually capable of moving forward and prevailing under such circumstances with our eyes open. I would say, well, the world reveals itself to you in accordance with your aims in the world. So I can say, well, the world has this proclivity to tilt towards tragedy and malevolence. What are you going to do about that? You need an aim that's so remarkable that acting towards it justifies the catastrophe of your existence. And you know, I can put that in prosaic form, and you all know this is true too. You need a reason to get out of bed in the morning when things aren't good. And things are not going to be good at some point. You know, there's going to be illness in your family. There's going to be the collapse of your dreams. There's going to be the pathology of your state. You're going to encounter all the vicissitudes of life. That's for sure. And if your goal is to be happy, well, that's not going to get you through the rough times, that's for sure, because you're not going to be happy then. And it's precisely during the rough times that you need to get through. And maybe you can say to yourself something like, well, look, what I'm doing instead is pursuing the noblest goal I could possibly conceive of. I'm going to take care of myself properly. I'm going to do that in a way that's of maximal benefit to my family. And I'm going to take care of myself and my family in a way that's of maximal benefit to my community. I'm going to take all those things into account simultaneously, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I can push back against the tragedy of the world, and I can constrain its malevolence. I can do that in my own heart, and I can help the people around me do that. And you can, in fact, do that. And certainly you can make it worse. That's absolutely undeniable, and that's actually a great place to start, because once you know that you can make it worse, you know at least that you could cease doing that. Well, right, well that's something, right? Even if you're not moving the world, extraordinarily rapidly towards heaven, you can move it at least somewhat quickly away from hell, at least the hell that you're capable of producing. And it's not like that's nothing, because you can cause a lot of trouble. You have that firmly within you have the power to cause a lot of trouble. You know that because you've probably already caused a lot of trouble now and then. And so you can at least stop doing that. You can see that ability by looking at capacity for destruction. You can see what you're capable of. And so that should give you some respect for yourself in a kind of a perverse manner. If you're that much of a force for catastrophe, imagine what sort of force for good you can be. You might be enough of a force for good to stand up as a bulwark against the catastrophe. I would say, well, so all that deep pessimism for me, in some sense, disappears. Because I do look at people and I think, man, we got it rough. Like, there's no doubt about it, that this is a veil of tears, and we can twist it into something that's quite hellish. But there's enough nobility in each of us so that we can actually work against that, and we can make the world a less tragic place, and we can definitely make it a less malevolent place, and we can work on that, like, right in our local environments, right? We can make our rooms clean and beautiful. We can make our families pristine. We can get our aims, we can sharpen our aim, and we can lift our eyes above the horizon and aim for what's best. We can do that. And what's so fascinating about that, you think, well, that immediately imbues your life with the kind of positive meaning that enables you to actually sustain the tragedy. It's like, I've got something worthwhile to do. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. It's like a brilliant phrase. And so, you know, one of the things I've been doing is traveling around the country now, like I am here, talking to people about exactly this, talking to them about maximizing their responsibility. You know, because your life is tragic, as we've already laid out. It's like, and so you need a way of imbuing that with the richest possible meaning, so that you don't become corrupted and resentful and angry and hostile and cruel and worse as a consequence of the burden that you have to bear that's placed upon you. It's like you can take that on voluntarily. You can think, well, I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to make absolutely everything around me as good as I can possibly make it. And not in some naive virtue signaling way. That isn't what I mean. I mean to take this on like it's the task of your life. And it is the task of your life. And then you think, well, what would that make possible in this world of ours? Well, we're remarkable creatures, you know. We're on a nice uphill trajectory at the moment, you know. Things all over the world are getting better really quite quickly, quite remarkably quickly, even though this isn't very well known because of our deep current pessimism, you know. People are being lifted out of poverty right now around the world at a rate that's absolutely unprecedented in the history of mankind. We lifted half the people who were in absolute poverty in the year 2000 were no longer in absolute poverty by the year 2012. That was more than 1 billion people. Right, so yeah, it's just absolutely amazing. About 300,000 people a week right now are being hooked to the power grid, and people are getting access to fresh water at an unprecedented rate, and infant mortality rates are declining precipitously all over the world, and the world's fastest growing economies are in sub-Saharan Africa, and no one is starving anywhere unless someone is trying to starve them to death, because there's actually enough food for everyone, and it doesn't look like we're going to run out. Our population is going to peak at about 9 billion, and we can probably handle that, especially given current growth rates in agricultural production. You know, and so we could move into this future that lies in front of us, especially with this technological prowess that we've been developing that's absolutely remarkable. We could move into this future, and God only knows how much of the actual tragedy of life we could push to the back, and how much of the malevolence that corrupts it we could obliterate. Who knows how good we could make things? And when you think, well, you're all bitter and twisted because life is difficult and you've been betrayed. It's like, look, fair enough, man. Life is difficult and you probably have been betrayed. But what are you going to do? You're going to make it worse? Well, that's not going to get you up in the morning, right? That's going to make you want to, who knows what that's going to make you want to do. It's not going to make you want to do something that's good, that's for sure. Instead, you could say, well, bring it on, you know, like I can handle it. You could accept all that voluntarily. That's rule 1, by the way. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's the injunction. It's like you can stand up and expose yourself to the catastrophe of the world. You can take that on voluntarily, right? As if there's enough of you to manage it. And the funny thing is, the strange thing is that, and you know this already, you know that if you're careful with yourself, every time you take on additional responsibility, you grow more character, right? That's how life works. And you're not going to grow more character and strength without taking on the load. You don't do that in the gym, right? You're not going to develop your musculature without pushing the amount of weight that you're lifting. You can't just wish your muscles into growth. You have to demand that they make themselves manifest. Well, you're like, all of you is like that. You think, well, you have this incalculable potential that people are always calling you on. You're not living up to your potential. You're not living up to your potential. You say that to yourself, and other people say it to you as well, because they know that hidden within you, in some sense, is the ability to take the entire catastrophe of the world onto your shoulders and to do everything you possibly can to make it better. And in that, you find the meaning in life that makes all that justifies all that tragedy, that maybe would even make it, I don't know if it would make it desirable, but it certainly makes it acceptable as a challenge. You need the challenge. And I think that the possibilities that lay open to us, perhaps more now than at any point in the past, are virtually without limit. And I would say that we're improving things quite rapidly, despite the fact that we're actually stumbling forth quite blindly. We could be more alert, more awake, and more committed to the good than we are substantially. And God only knows how much we could accelerate what we're doing and how good we can make things. And if you're careful, you could start that locally so you don't cause too much trouble. You can just figure out what's wrong with you. You could just ask yourself, you'll get a big list. And then you can start working on it, point by point and bit by bit. Say, look, I'm going to make tomorrow a little bit better than yesterday. I'm going to do that iteratively, and I'm going to do that every day. And I'm going to see what happens if I use everything at my disposal to push back against the catastrophe of the world, because maybe that would set things right. And that's rule number 6, which is the one I'll close with. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And so what does that mean? It means God only knows what there is to you, and if you take on the responsibility, for the fact that things aren't exactly how you would want them to be, and you decide that you're going to begin to set them right, it's possible that you'll mold yourself across time into precisely the person who's capable of doing that. And why wouldn't you? That's how it works. And so it seems perfectly reasonable that each of us could do that, and God only knows what would happen if we all did. So it seems to me that it would be a lovely thing for all of us to try, and it's a good time in the history of our species, let's say, for us to wake up and do precisely that. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Wow. Was that amazing?
Yes.
Oh, incredible. And I noticed all of you standing up straight with your shoulders back. Thank you for doing that. We've gotten past rule 1. Perfect. Dr. Peterson will be back in just a moment. I hope some of you submitted some questions over the internet. He'll come back. He'll have a seat. He'll go answer some of your questions. We'll do about 30 minutes of Q&A. Yes, it's going to be wonderful. And then this is like the 16th show on this tour, and every night, every lecture is different. It's just, if you'd like to visit us again, we've got, we're in Minneapolis, tomorrow night Milwaukee, Minneapolis after that, a West Coast swing, and then we go Canada in July, so please feel free to join us again for another lecture. Dr. Peterson will be out here shortly. This is really a movement. I think it really feels wonderful. I'm glad you guys are here to see the start of what is going to be amazing. Everywhere we've gone, we're drawing bigger and bigger crowds. So, are you guys ready for the Q&A? Yeah. Then please welcome back to the stage Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Great job, man.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so here's a question. We'll start with this one. Are you aware that today, yes, today, is National Lobster Day? No, I wasn't aware of that, but I'm very happy to hear it. So that's pretty damn funny. So here's another thing, and I don't get this at all. This is quite strange. So I've been trying to learn how to tie a Windsor knot in my tie, and I just started that like 2 days ago, because I have this thin tie that doesn't look quite right without a Windsor knot, and then there's a question here let me just find it, and I don't understand why in the world. Have you thought about switching to the full Windsor? So, yes, I have. I've actually been practicing. So I don't know what in the world to know what to do about that. That's for sure. Okay, you've accumulated fame so quickly over the last few years. How do you keep yourself humble? And then there's another question like that, which is, it's quite similar, which is, what are you doing to protect yourself from corruption since being put on a pedestal? What can others do in the same situation? Well, okay, so let's answer those. Well, I do these sorts of things that I was talking about to you today. You know, I have an aim, let's say, that I've thought through very deeply. I mean, when I wrote my first book, which I told you about, the audio version is out, Maps of Meaning, I thought about what happened in Auschwitz. And I thought about it from the perspective of a perpetrator, not from the perspective of a bystander or a victim, let's say. I thought, how is it that people could do what was done in Auschwitz by the guards? But I thought about that more specifically. I thought, how is it that that person who is human could do that, given that I'm also human and I can't see how I could do that? And then I thought about it until I could figure out how I could do it. And then I figured out that I could do it. And then I figured out that I could probably enjoy it. And so that scared me enough so that I figured out that I tried to see what the antidote to that might be. So I get as far away from that as possible. And so I would say that part of what I do to keep my feet on the ground is I remember the immense capacity for evil that every single one of us is characterized by. And I am terrified enough of that, let's say, to try to orient myself properly in the world. Say that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's a good way of thinking about it. You could say there's also a reason why people conceptualize hell, let's say, because if you want to keep yourself on the up and up, it's one thing to be aiming for heaven, but it's another thing to be aiming away from hell. And I don't care how cynical you are, you can be cynical enough so that you don't believe in heaven, but there's no way you can be cynical enough so that you don't believe in hell. And so once having established that, if you have any sense at all, then at least you can aim away from that. And if that's what you're doing and you know how deep that place really is, then that can help you keep your feet on the ground. That's what it looks like to me. So that's one of the answers. I try to aim as far away from that as possible. You know, and so that's part of what I laid out tonight. It's like, what am I trying to do? Well, you know, I have my flaws, and so no doubt I'm not doing this perfectly, but I'm definitely trying to aim away from that. Trying to take care of myself. Trying to take care of myself in a way that's maximally beneficial to my family. And I'm trying to do both of those in a way that's maximally beneficial to the community. That's what I'm trying to do. And the reason I'm trying to do that is partly because that's the best way away from hell, and so that's a pretty good start. But I also am doing that because I can't think of anything better possibly to do. And so it's an immense challenge to do that, and you need a challenge, right? And so why not have that as a challenge? And I've thought these things through. They're not shallow commitments. That doesn't mean that I'm without error, but they're not shallow commitments. And then The other thing that you have to do, if you want to stop yourself from being corrupted, is you want to surround yourself with the right people. Rule 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And Rule 2 is treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for helping. And Rule 3 is make friends with the people who want the best for you. And those aren't injunctions about how to have a happier life. They're injunctions about how to act morally in the world. You need to take care of yourself like you're someone who's worthwhile. And you need to have people around you who view you in the same way. And that doesn't mean they're letting you off the hook. Quite the contrary. And so I'm fortunate. I have 2 kids, and they're both very sensible, and their eyes are open, and they're watching what I'm doing. And if I'm making a mistake, or they think I'm making a mistake, or not being cautious enough, they tell me. My son takes away my Twitter password all the time. Yeah. No, and then, I can get it back, because I can always reset the password. But it's kind of like a hint, So, when I travel with my wife, and she keeps an eye on me, she's always in the crowd, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's a sensible person, and she's being tempered in her own particular fire, and so she watches. And then I have friends around me and an extended family, and they're all watching, and they don't hesitate at all to let me know if they think that what I'm doing is working. But if it's not working and they think I made a mistake, it's like we have a phone call and they tell me exactly what they think I did wrong and how I can fix it, and I listen, because I don't want to do any more things wrong than absolutely necessary. And so I would say part of the reason that I keep my feet on the ground, let's say, because I hate to say I keep myself humble because I don't want to claim that, but I'm trying to keep my feet on the ground, is because I'm properly terrified of doing things wrong. And so I'm doing my best to be very careful about what I say and what I do. And so far, that hasn't produced any catastrophic consequences. So hooray for that. So okay, well, this is very serious, and I don't know if I should address it because I'm somewhat tired, but I'll give it a shot because it's important. Now, it's very serious and troublesome question. I plan on taking my own life very soon. Why shouldn't I? Well, I'm going to assume this isn't a casual question, that's been put out for the purposes of display. Well, the first thing I would say is you have to think very carefully through the consequences of that for other people. So I've had clients in my clinical practice who never recovered from the suicide of a family member. Decades later, they're still torturing themselves about it. And so that's what you leave behind. Now, the problem is you might be dreaming about that, because maybe you're feeling that life has been twisted against you and that people deserve to suffer for the misery that they've imposed upon you. But I would say think very, very carefully before you go down that route. It's a terrible thing to leave people with. And so part of the reason that suicide has been illegal in most societies is because it absolutely devastates the people you leave behind. And you might think, well, if you're really depressed, then maybe you're really depressed. That's a possibility. You might think, well, those people would be better off without me. It's like, and if you get really depressed, you can think that way, and you can even get to the point where you can't think any other way than that. And I would say, if you're at the point where you can't think any other way than that, then you should tell someone and you should go to the hospital. Because that can happen, and it can happen if you get depressed. And there are treatments for depression, and many of them work. For some people, antidepressants work like mad. Now, they don't work for everyone, and I'm not claiming that they're a panacea, but they certainly beat the hell out of suicide. Right? And even if they have some negative side effects, and sometimes they do, quite frequently they do, the negative side effects aren't fatal. It's like, well, there's the possibility that your condition is physical, that you're ill in some way, either physically or perhaps you have a psychological problem, maybe you were hurt, or there's lots of reasons that people get depressed that are very, very complex. I would say don't give up hope and do something final before you've explored all possible options. And if you haven't talked to a psychologist, you haven't talked to a psychiatrist, you haven't tried antidepressants, you haven't revealed to your family or people that care for you that this is how you're feeling, then you owe it to yourself and them to Explore every possible avenue before you take such a step. And then you don't want to deprive the world of what you could bring to the world. That's the other thing, you have intrinsic value, and you can't just casually bring that to an end. You leave a hole in the fabric of being itself. So, and a wise man that I once worked with said, he was a very strange person. He was a psychologist at the maximum security prison in Edmonton, and I worked with him for a while. Briefly, very briefly, at the prison itself. And he said, you can always commit suicide tomorrow. And that's a very, it's a flippant statement in some sense, but he meant it in a very serious way. It's like, you only get to decide that once. And you can put it off. And so I would say just put it off, and then put it off some more, and then put it off some more, and see what you can do to put yourself together. You explore every possible option. And if you're so hopeless that you have a suicidal plan, which is a real sign of danger, if you really know how you would do it and you've thought it out, then I would say, tell someone for God's sake, tell them, or go to a hospital and tell them. And for sure, try antidepressants, but what the hell do you have to lose? So do everything you possibly can to address the issue before you do something like that. And do give some thought to the people that you're going to leave behind, because believe me, you may just absolutely wipe them out in a way that they will never recover from. You cannot fix someone's suicide. You're stuck with it. And you think you torture yourself for the rest of your life. If I would have only known, if I would have only said something different. This particular client talked to her relative, a sibling, who committed suicide, like 20 minutes before he committed suicide, probably after he took the pills. And she was kind of preoccupied because you don't know that the person at the other end is at the end of their tether. And she never forgave herself for not responding properly in that last phone call. That's a hell of a thing to leave someone with. So I would say, and the final thing I would say is, don't be so sure that your life is yours to take. You don't own yourself the way that you own an object. You have a moral obligation to yourself as a locus of divine value, let's say. You can't treat that casually. It's wrong. So those are the reasons. Explore everything you can explore to put yourself back on your feet. All the things. There's all sorts of treatments for depression. Don't leave the people around you with that to suffer from for the rest of their lives. Don't underestimate your value in the world. And don't underestimate the fact that suicide is wrong. And so those are 4 reasons why you shouldn't end your life soon, or at all, for that matter. So good luck to you. I'm an artist at Heron Art School. What's your advice for a young artist trying to shatter the conventions of political correctness? Well, the first would be probably get the hell out of art school. But that's actually fairly straightforward. But look, if you want to shatter the conventions of political correctness, which is, I don't think any field has been warped more thoroughly than fine art by political correctness, So, and that's really saying something, because plenty of fields have been plenty warped. But I would say your best bet, there's twofold. One is learn how to manage your career in an effective business-like manner. Make yourself cutthroat in terms of putting yourself together economically. Because if you're it's really, 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 really hard to monetize artistic production. And so if you're going to support yourself being an artist, you better be a sharp business person. There's nothing that irritates political correct people more than that development. So you can start by that. It's like develop yourself into a canny negotiator and see if you can figure out how you could actually have a career as an artist. I would say to begin with, what you're probably going to have to do is have an actual job and do your art part-time, because unless you're phenomenally talented, and even then it probably won't work. So you can have your job, and then you can work really hard on your art, and with any luck, over the period of about a decade, you can build connection networks, and you can learn how the gallery system works, and you can meet influential people, and you can sell your art, and maybe you can start to figure out how to make a living. you got to figure that's going to take like 25-30% of your time at an absolute minimum, but you might as well get great at that. And that'll irritate the hell out of your politically correct colleagues. So because they'll say you sold out, and people who say that, those are people who've never had the opportunity to sell out, and so haven't. Yes, and justify that absolute failure with a facade of moral respectability. So it's an appalling game. The other thing you can do is study great artists throughout history and then hone your craft. Because there's this idea that's sort of a postmodern idea that, well, it's all freedom of expression and you don't need any skill. It's like, that's not wrong. It's like, it's anti-true. It's worse than wrong. It's not just an error, it's like you know what the truth is and then you figure out the exact opposite of that and then you put that forward as a proposition. It's like develop your skill, you know, learn to paint, learn to draw, learn to sculpt, learn to build things and become a craftsperson, all these things. Develop your skill and your discipline as well, and then maybe you'll be able to transcend that discipline with the skill and produce something truly original. But you can make yourself, you can master the techniques of the great artists of the past. And you know, the trendy types who say, well, that's all passé. It's like, it's not nearly as passé as their damn opinions are going to be 10 years from now. So, I have a friend who's kind of an interesting guy. You can find him on YouTube. His name is Jonathan Pajot. And he was in an art school like you at a place called Concordia, which is like mind-bogglingly politically correct. And he was actually a pretty good postmodernist scholar in his own right. And he got completely tired of the political correctness that characterized the art schools. And he became a medieval carver of orthodox icons. That was his reaction against the trendy politically correct orthodoxy. He makes absolutely beautiful pieces. They're worth taking a look at. So that's Jonathan Pajot. And now he's making YouTube videos about symbolism in Christian art that are really, really quite good. And he's actually making a living doing that, that's so funny, eh? It's like, imagine how unlikely that is that, well, first he's Canadian, and second of all, so that's unlikely to begin with. And the second is that he's making a living talking about carving Orthodox Christian icons. It's like, no one will ever make a living doing that. And so, he decided that he was going to do exactly what you want to do, which is, and you don't want to shatter the conventions of political correctness. You want to be an artist. And if you are an artist, see, an artist isn't someone who produces art. It's like, that's a big mistake. An artist is someone who uses art as a tool to investigate the structure of reality and to extend the human capacity to perceive. That's what an artist does. And artists are really, really, really important. And so you want to develop your skill so that you can extend the limits of the human relationship with beauty and truth, and you can transform the manner in which people perceive so that they can see beauty where they only saw memory before. That's what you want to do. And if you do that, then you're an artist. You'll shatter all sorts of conventions in the most... And you don't want to just set out to shatter conventions. That's like breaking a store window. Anybody can do that. You want to replace them with a better set of conventions. That's the right way of transcending those conventions, and you can do that if you discipline yourself into being a true artist. Let me tell you some things about true artists, man, because it's no joke. So here's thing number one. So Johann Sebastian Bach. First of all, there's about 5 composers that dominate the classical music world, and they only 5. That's none compared to all the composers who've ever lived. And their works compose about half the classical repertoire. And only a tiny proportion of the works that they wrote are played. And let's talk about Bach, because he's one of the 5. He wrote so much music that it would take someone 40 years just to copy it by hand if they worked 8-hour days. Okay, so you just think about that. Now let's talk about Picasso for a minute. Think, how many paintings, sculptures, and other objects of art did Picasso produce? well, let's say he had a 70-year career. 65,000. He produced 3 fully formed pieces of art a day for 65 years, every single day. So it's just, and you think about the cumulative value of his production, it's like the cumulative value, it's like the GDP of a decent-sized country. It's absolutely phenomenal. And so if you want to be an artist, man, you've got big shoes to fill. It's the hardest thing to be. And you have to be unbelievably disciplined and attentive and oriented and exploratory and courageous and all of that, and sharp on all fronts to be an artist. And then you won't have to worry about the conventions of political correctness, because those people will be so far behind you that you won't even be able to see them anymore. So that's what we do. When will the biblical series, lecture series, continue? December. That's the theory. I'm going to do the same thing that I did last year, which is to rent a small theater in Toronto. And I'm going to start doing the stories of Moses, the Exodus stories, and so forth. And I'm really looking forward to that. I have a sneaking suspicion that there isn't anything more important that I can do than to continue with those biblical lectures. But I mean, this is good to go around and talk to people. This is a really good thing right now. But I think in over any reasonable amount of time, I'd be a fool not to continue to pursue that, partly because there seems to be a real demand for it. Who would have guessed? So preposterous. You know, it's even worse than Jonathan Pageau's situation, as far as I'm concerned. And I learned an unbelievable amount doing it, so I'm really looking forward to starting it up again. And so the plan right now is to do that in December. And so that's the answer to that question. So, how can we be sure that we are not in a cult? Well, I don't know about you. Convince me, please. Well, no. Like, look. There are ways you know that you're in a cult. I mean, really, like a cult isn't just some little system of belief or something like that. Cult is a cult, and cults have, like, there are people who study cults, and they sort of define them. I mean, one is a cult leader alienates you from your family and friends. Because one of the rules of being in a cult is you don't get to associate with anyone who isn't in the cult. Okay, so are you being alienated from your family and friends? If the answer, or maybe you're doing that yourself, but that's your problem. So if you're speaking about, paying attention to what I've been saying, I haven't told you to alienate yourself from your family and friends. I told you to get your bloody act together so that you're good for your family and your friends. That's like the opposite of a cult. So then the next thing is a cult leader takes all your time and money. It's like, I haven't taken all your money, and I haven't taken all your time. So on the 3 primary dimensions of cult, I'm batting 0. So it's a ridiculous compare. I mean, I understand why you made the comparison, because obviously there's something about this set of ideas that has a compelling nature of some manner, and you have every reason to be skeptical and leery of that. And I tell my students at the beginning of my Maps of Meaning course that they should do everything they possibly can to find everything they possibly can wrong about what I'm telling them. That's their job in the course. To listen, of course. And if they can figure out something that's wrong, they should tell me, because if it's wrong, I'd like to fix it. And so I don't think that a cult can be built on a message of fundamental individual responsibility. I think that's an anti-cult phenomenon, right? You think it's a cult of individuals. It's like, well, I don't think so. So it's good that you're skeptical. It's good that you're asking that question. But the cult comparison isn't a good one, because, well, for the reasons I just said, the question then is, well, is there reason to be skeptical of the ideas that I'm putting forth? And I would say, well, of course there is. You should be skeptical of ideas. But I would also say you should give some consideration to the fact that these aren't precisely my ideas. You know, what I've been trying to do is aggregate a set of great ideas that have been, they've been handed down historically. Some of them have been discovered scientifically, and to try to present those in a compelling form, to put old wine in new bottles, let's say. And of course you want to be skeptical about that and watchful, but that doesn't mean that it's a cult, and it doesn't mean necessarily that there's any intrinsic danger. Now, I guess the other thing you want to figure out is, they say, by their fruits ye shall know them. That's the statement in the New Testament. It's like, if you've been listening to these lectures and you've been putting the principles into practice, you've been developing a vision for your own life and taking more responsibility and trying to tell the truth, what's the consequence of that? Like, and people talk to me all the time, they say, well, things are better for me. It's like, well, good. If they're better for you, maybe they're better for you and your family, or they're better for you and the people you have intimate relationships with. It's like, that's good. That's a good diagnostic indicator. If you try out the ideas and they make things better, then, well, that seems to be a good piece of evidence, so that's what I would watch for. And you can make up your own mind. Stay skeptical while you're doing it. So, okay. Why does your message mainly resonate with white people? There's no evidence for that. So it's not a question that can be answered properly. In fact, I think it's probably a question that's not posed properly. What's your evidence that it does? To question like that, which is actually a kind of accusation in shorthand, it's like you need evidence. It's like, what's your evidence for that? So you don't have any evidence, then. And what do you mean mainly, exactly? Because we're going to be exact about this. It's like, there's probably a black person out here. It's like, what are you going to do about that person? No? So, no, that's not a good question. What do you think is the greatest threat towards Western society? Your unresolved weaknesses and errors. I mean that. I actually mean that. I mean that particularly. It's like the West is predicated on the idea of the divinity of the individual, and that's mostly associated with individual responsibility. And so to the degree that you abdicate that responsibility, you're the threat. It's as simple as that. Is the carnivore diet sustainable long term? No. I suspect that sometime in the next 50 years I'm going to die. So, all right. You say it will take you 3.5 more years, I don't think I was that precise, to answer the question of Christianity / God / Jesus. Is this an honest answer out of respect or a non-answer? Well, it's a vague guess, first of all. I mean, look, there's lots of things that I haven't prepared myself properly to talk about. And I'm making my way through these biblical lectures. I don't know how far I'll get with them because God only knows what happens in life. But I can't answer questions that I don't know how to answer. And so it is an honest answer. Is out of respect? No, it's out of recognition, perhaps, but mostly it's out of recognition of my own ignorance. You know, the things that I talked to you about tonight, I understand. I don't understand them completely because no one understands anything completely. But I feel like I'm on solid ground with regards to what I talked to you tonight. Like I know the literature on perception well enough to tell you about it and to tell you about how that's related to emotions and motivation. and to lay out the relationship between value and perception and all of that. Because I've done the work, I've read the papers, I've written the papers for that matter. I've done the work, and so I'm on solid ground. But there's lots of things that exceed my capacity. I do believe that I believe that our highly functional Western societies are grounded in the Judeo-Christian ethic, and that fundamentally that's a religious ethic, and that it makes a number of metaphysical claims. So I have great respect for the ethic and for the stories, but I'm unable to assess the metaphysical claims, and the reason for that is I'm ignorant. I just don't know enough. I don't understand them well enough. Like, with regard to the idea of the death and resurrection of Christ, like, I view that psychologically and symbolically, but that doesn't mean that I think that exhausts the story, because I don't believe that my knowledge exhausts the story. But I believe, for example, that the part of you that's capable of transcending tragedy and malevolence is the part that dies and is reborn. You have to leave the corrupt parts of yourself behind. You have to let those burn off, and you have to let your spirit be renewed continually. And that's an ancient story, and I think that has affinity with the idea of the dying and resurrecting Savior. Now, I don't think that exhausts the idea, but that's as far as I've been able to push it. I mean, in my wildest moments, and this is speculation, right? This is speculation. I think the idea that Christ died for our sins and that mankind was redeemed is correct, but we still have to do the work. It's something like that. Now, that's a metaphysical statement, and I don't understand how it can be right, because I'm talking about things that no one can know of in some sense. But when I push myself out to the limits of my knowledge and ask, that's the sort of answer that comes to me. It's like, there is something about the idea of the individual sacrificing himself for taking the sins of mankind onto himself. That's a real idea. I think that's what people should do, is that, in some sense, is that you're responsible for the catastrophe of the world. I believe that. And I also believe that taking that on in the fullest possible way would transform you beyond recognition. And I don't know what the ultimate limit of that is. Because you could say that the story of the death and resurrection is a limit story, like the story of the crucifixion. The crucifixion is suffering that can't be exceeded in some sense, because it's the most possible suffering for the most innocent possible person. So that's the perfect tragedy, right? And so there's an idea that whatever Christ is that which takes on the tragedy of the world, and that which confronts malevolence and overcomes it. And that's the story of Christ in the desert, for example, when he encounters Satan. And the story of the crucifixion is the willingness to bear the catastrophe of existence voluntarily. And there's an idea that doing that produces a kind of transfiguration, and I think that that's all true. But I don't know what the limits of that truth are. And so I'm pushing it as far as I possibly can within the domain of my limited understanding, but I can't push it past that. And so I know I have 300 books stacked up at home that I need to read, that people have been sending me to get through this more deeply than I've been able to get through it so far. And so it's recognition of my own ignorance, and it's respect for the complexity of the problem. And I said, well, 3 years or 4 years, that was just an estimate based on how quickly I've been going through the biblical stories. But God only knows if I'll get any deeper into it than I've already been able to manage. So that's my answer, I guess. Cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be the most widely implemented theoretical orientation in modern practice, in clinical practice. What's your primary modality in therapy with clients? I'm a behaviorist to begin with, because I look for simple solutions. It's like, well, let's say before I get all psychoanalytic on people, I mean, you want to save that and the Jungian stuff for exceptional circumstances, as far as I'm concerned. If a client comes to me, here's the situation. Someone comes to me, and it's because their life is going the way that it needs to go. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. And so I think, well, let's decompose the problem. Why are you unhappy? What does your unhappiness consist of? And so that'll take a lot of conversation. That's the diagnosis. It's like, well, do you have any friends? How are you doing with your family? How's your career going? Are you attending to your education? Are you attending to your mental and physical health? Do you have a productive and useful use for your time outside of work? And are you swamped by temptations like drug and alcohol use or sexual misbehavior? It's a good way of deconstructing. It's like, how are you doing on all those dimensions? If you do my future authoring program, by the way, which is part of the self-authoring suite, then it will ask you all those questions. And so if you want to do it, I made a discount for all of you. You can use a code called 12 Rules, and that'll knock the price down by 50%, so just so you know. But I tried to put the essence of useful cognitive behavioral clinical practice into an exercise that people can do on their own. So I want to find out exactly what is your problem as far as you're concerned. And then what we want to do is implement the simplest possible behavioral solutions. And so I start from the bottom. Simple solutions, right? It's like, or maybe you're badly out of shape physically and that's contributing to your depression. It's like, okay, how much exercise do you do? I'll get you to track that for a week. Don't change anything. Just see how much walking you do. It's like, well, I walked like half a mile this week. It's like, okay, well, how about next week you try walking 6/10 of a mile, right? Small incremental behavioral improvements. It's a very straightforward way to help people, and it's a really useful way. And you should try the simplest possible way, and that's why I like the behavioral approach. Now, I have clients, usually the ones who are creative, who also benefit tremendously from a more Jungian approach, a more symbolic approach. They're often people who dream a tremendous amount and who are creative in their essence. And I use that when it seems appropriate and necessary, but that's rarer. So this is very noisy, this thing. So, like me, I guess. So, let's see. Now this will be the last one, because I have to stop at some point. Do you have any advice for a student studying psychology? Yes. Go to my website. There's a reading list there of the best books that I've found in my studies as a psychologist. There's about 20 of them. Go read those books, and that'll put you head and shoulders ahead. There's a lot of them are biological, because psychologists, especially the animals, experimental psychologists and the neuroscientists, have made great strides in understanding the way the brain works. You really need to know about that, because it's profound and interesting and relevant. And then there's a list of books written by the great clinicians, and I think they're unbelievably useful as well. So go read all those books, and that'll, if you want to understand psychology, that'll really put you ahead. So this one, and that's it. Dr. Peterson, what do you do to relax and have a good time? I come here to answer questions from audiences. So I'm having a fun.
It's my pleasure.
The world easily incalculable.
Is
Easily incalculable. Your specific positive impact.
Well, good question, I guess. I mean, the question is, I'm going to reformulate it slightly, is what if the gentleman who asked the question said, asked me about how I contemplate my incalculable impact on the world. Well, there's a technical answer to that, which is, I learned this from reading Jung about 30 years ago. He wrote this essay called Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. It's a real work of genius, and it warns people who deal with archetypal ideas about the dangers that involves. And one of the things Jung said was, don't confuse the ideas with yourself. Like I've aggregated a lot of knowledge, a lot of it archetypal, some of it biological, some of it at the intersections between those things. You have to be very careful not to take credit for things. You know, I'm fortunate because I've been able to study these things, and I've been able to articulate at least what I think they mean. But the ideas and the stories vastly predate me, and they're going to be here a lot longer after I'm gone. So it's nice to be able to participate in them and to maybe help shed some new light on them, I suppose. But I'm very careful to distinguish that from me. So, and you need to do that. See, his essay warned of inflation, which would be a kind of narcissistic grandiosity, I suppose, and that's a very dangerous risk when you're investigating these sorts of things. But if you're properly terrified about the negative consequences, then I think you can avoid the worst excesses. I hope. We'll see. So that's what it looks like to me.
Your talk included the idea that I should be right. Fundamentally, you want to have Testament that is true questions as well. You got to know why you do this.
Well, I believe it's sort of universally true in an ethical sense. You know, is that that's actually, I can't tell you exactly why I think it's true. I think that, I was trying to outline that a bit today. Life is an intolerable burden in some ways. You know, because it's beyond us, right? It kills us. It's beyond us. It's like, well, what do you do in the face of an impossible problem? It's you adopt an impossible solution. And the impossible solution is to voluntarily bear that and work towards its improvement. And the strange thing is, I think we can do that. And so I would say, at minimum, psychologically speaking, Christ is an exemplar of that. Right? And so it's something to aim at. And of course, that's an idea that's at the bottom. See, the thing about these ideas, too, is you can't easily dismiss them. Because it is the case that our culture has a Judeo-Christian foundation. And that means something. It means we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's what it means. It's the self-evidence in that statement. And the self-evidence has something to do with the fact that in your country, in my country, the individual is to be regarded as of intrinsic value, not given by the state, right, of intrinsic value, and worthwhile, and of what would you say, of fundamental responsibility, because the weight of the state falls on your shoulders. Is that true or not? Our culture is founded on it. Seems to be doing pretty well. So that's something. And we can't just dispense with those ideas like they're nothing. There's something to it. So, well, for me, I don't feel that that's my place. In fact, I think it would be damaging if I did that. You know, I'm going to push myself out to the limits of what I know, and then hopefully I'll be silent after that. And if I learn some more, so that I actually know it, well, then maybe I can talk about it. But until then, I try not to talk about it.
Well, you believe it's possible for the study that you would actually arrive at
Oh, not the answer. I think, well, what I found with these stories is the deeper you dig, the deeper they go. There's no bottom. You know, and God only knows how complicated things really are. They're complicated.
So where do you stop to feel satisfied? Is there satisfaction in this life, or is it just a lifelong?
Well, there's satisfaction in the quest. You know, and I think that's the right answer. There's satisfaction in the quest. It's the right answer. You know, it's something like that. So you don't want to run out of things to do anyways. So
Kind of along the same lines there, very impressed with your ability to articulate and your willingness to say, you know, acknowledge who are taking you there. I think of that you as the same vein of like a St. Paul or St. Augustine or C.S. Lewis, that when God comes to you and grasps you, it comes by the way of the Spirit, not by the way of the hand.
Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm open to whatever possibilities manifest themselves, I suppose. I mean, it's certainly been extraordinarily gratifying to go around from city to city doing these talks. They're insanely positive. And so, that's a lovely thing. And somebody asked tonight about a cult, and about the dangers of that. Well, it's a fair question, but I can tell you what I experienced, and some of that happened tonight, is that wherever I go now, I meet people. They're invariably insanely polite. They come and talk to me. They're happy to see me. They usually have a touching story to tell me. If they don't just want a picture or something like that, they usually they tell me something about the state their life was in, a disordered state of one form or another, and sometimes severely disordered. I had a kid tell me the other day. It was so cool. I talked to him for 10 seconds. He said, a year and a half ago, I just got out of jail and I was homeless. And now I'm married, I have a child, and I just bought my own apartment. He said it was because he was watching my lectures. That's a good thing. And so, the reason I brought that up is because you were talking about love. What's extraordinarily gratifying about all of this is that there's plenty of that to be had. So it seems like it's going quite well, and we'll see how that continues. My more sensible part is expecting catastrophe, because it just seems too crazy to be sustainable. But so far so good. So we'll see. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a good question. Well,
Can it be restated?
Oh yes. The lady who asked this question has a particularly tough-spirited 6-year-old. She's trying to figure out how to deal with him without, crunching him too hard. I wrote chapter 5. Don't let the chapter anything that makes you dislike it. I would say you need to talk to your partner. You need to get your disciplinary strategy straight. You need to decide where your limit is. And you have to be honest about that. It's probably, from what you told me, my suspicions is you're probably allowing yourself to be pushed a little farther than your limit. Try a week where you don't let him do anything that pushes you past your limits. Stop fighting and see what happens. My suspicions are he'll like you better at the end of the week, and you'll like him better too. But you have to have a discussion about that, right? That can be real war. Really, it can be outright war. You don't want it to be more brutal than it has to be. But you're the adult. There's two of you together. You should be able to put up a united front, and it would be good for him to find out exactly where the limits are. If he's a pushy character, what that means in part is he can be really well socialized. Because a kid like that wants to know where the line is. Like a kid that isn't as tough-minded, the line can be this thick and vague. For a kid like that, it's no. He wants to know exactly where the line is. And the advantage to that is that if you can show him exactly where the line is and part of his behavior, he can become unbelievably sophisticated socially. And so that's the advantage in that kind of pushiness. But I would say it also sounds like he's tough enough so that you're probably not going to take the spirit of it. My suspicions are he'll like you better. My son was like that. He was tough as a boot, right from day one. And one of the things I experienced was he'd get out of hand a bit and annoy me or annoy my wife, and we would get together and talk. So that kid, he's pushing limits again. Okay, for the next 3 days, he gets away with nothing. Every time, he liked this better. It really shocked me because I wasn't sure that would happen. But, he's looking for a solid word, making it more secure. Paradoxical. So, courage. He won't, by being reasonable in your disciplinary strategies and firm, he will do him no harm, even though there might be a lot of sparks and light around him. That's also part of the testing. So, you bet. Good luck with it. Yeah.
Your comment that Christian love is all labor or man and children.
Yeah.
And is it hopeless for them?
No.
Sometimes it seems like
Well, I mean,
once you reach a certain point, it's hopeless.
well, I mean, you know, the problem is that you can accumulate so many undone things around you that you're too old to deal with them. You know what I mean? Your life can turn into a mess. Most people aren't in that situation. I have had the odd client who was tangled up so deeply that they couldn't get up. Because we fix one thing and three other things would break. And we fix one of them and they were in the nest of the hybrids. Cut off one head, 7 more. And there was a couple of people that it was just too much. Couldn't be done. But most of the time, and this is why I like the story of Abraham, for example, the Old Testament story. I mean, Abraham is 80 by the time he leaves home. You know, it's way too late for him to be doing what he's doing, but he does it anyways. And, you know, there's a good Christian idea, I suppose, it's unique to Christianity, that, you know, you redeem at any point. You might have to pay a price for it. That's the other thing, you know. Because you have to atone for what you've done and not done. And if there's a lot of that, it makes the atoning hard. That doesn't mean it's impossible. So when I've seen people take pretty big steps pretty late in their life, better late than never. That's for sure. So, yeah.
Do you think there the ultimate goal is to have the most opportunity, the most opportunities in life? So certainly safety is
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I struggle with setting plans to
Yeah.
this role is another role on the better.
Yeah.
This career
It's a good question. It's a good question. Yeah. Okay, so, well, one thing I would say is you might want to listen to Maps of Meaning if you're interested in that, because it was an issue I tried to work out in that book, which is the relationship between discipline and freedom. You know, you can think of those as opposed. Say, well, if you pick one path, all those other paths aren't open to you. Those other paths are only open to you in potential, though. And your potential has to match that. It's the Peter Pan story. Right? Peter Pan wants to stay a kid because Pan means everything, essentially. And so he wants to retain the infinite possibility of childhood. But then he ends up king of the Lost Boys. It's like in Neverland. Well, Neverland doesn't exist. And who wants to be king of the Lost Boys anyways? And he won't grow up because he sees Captain Hook. Captain Hook's a tyrant. Right? And the reason he's a tyrant is because he's terrified of death. And death, well, in the Peter Pan story, it's the crocodile with the clock in his stomach. It's already got a piece of it. And so Hook is a tyrant because he's terrified of death. And Peter Pan won't grow up because the only thing he sees in adulthood is tyranny. Well, he's king of the Lost Boys and he doesn't get Wendy either. So, okay, so the upshot of all that is it's okay to make a decision. You know, you limit yourself, but in that limiting, you also expand yourself. You know, like if you this is what happens in science, for example. Let's say you pick a narrow problem to focus on. Because you have to. You can't focus on all the problems. You can pick one small problem. And when you start to work on that problem, it expands. You get disciplined and it expands. And so you pick some constraints. They be constraints of relationship, they be constraints of career, and you accept those and discipline yourself. And the consequence of that is that that expands out. It's like you have to pass through a bottleneck. So your potential as a child, you discipline that. It's a real system of constraint. It's a sacrifice as well. It's a sacrifice of all those other potentials. But the payoff is you discipline yourself and you start to expand out. So the way that I deal with that usually in my clinical practice is implement the best plan you have. You say, well, I'm going to wait around for better plans. That's not a good plan because you're not informing yourself while you're waiting around. So if you implement a plan and it's not a perfect plan, at least you know why it's wrong then. Specifically, not vaguely, you know exactly why it's wrong. Then you can fix the damn plan. So I would say, you lose a lot less by sacrificing than you think, and you gain a lot more. So that's what it looks like to me. Move forward, man. That's right. Well, life's short. Move forward. That's the call to adventure in the Abrahamic stories. It's like, constantly what happens to those people is God calls them to move forward. They do it. It's a bloody catastrophe, but it's better than staying where you are. Right, exactly. Yeah.
My action in Peterson is I feel like I have a similar issue that you have, but in a different way. So, at what point can you recognize that you sacrifice perhaps too much of yourself and too many opportunities? In my case, it's for my family, my mother.
Yeah. Yeah. Bitter.
Right.
Bitterness.
Not bitter.
No. Just one of the ways that you can tell. It's like you can tell. One of the things I counsel people to, and I talk about this in Followers for Life too, is consult your resentment. Okay, let's say that you notice you're resentful. It's like, okay, you're resentful. Why are you resentful? There's only two reasons. One is you're useless and whiny, and you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility. Possibility number one. Possibility number two is you're taking too much onto yourself without sufficient recompense or reward. So you're taking advantage of yourself, or you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of. It's one of those two. It's like, okay, so how do you figure out which one it is? Well, suspect the first one, right? Because you should always be a little suspicious in relationship to yourself. It's a little helpful that way. And I don't mean excessively, but to be skeptical anyway. Talk to some people about it. Find out. People you trust, they might say, no, you're not being whiny at all. You're taking way too much on. It's like, well, then you have to figure out how you can reward yourself for that burden or shed some of it so that you have equanimity. Because you have to be just to yourself. I said, well, you should take on as much responsibility as you can, but that also means as much as you can. If you're starting to get resentful, that's often a sign that you've taken on so much that you're grinding yourself into the ground. It's a bad strategy from a sustainability perspective. So consult your resentment and see. Because you want to be able to iterate it. You want to be able to maintain the burden across time. And resentment can be a sign that you've taken on such a load that you can't do that. So that's a partial answer to that.
Your star is rising, and I think everybody would agree with that. How you're attacked so frequently now as your star rises. What do you think you've been most misunderstood about? Because your words are constantly twisted. We watch interviews with you all the time.
That's a sharp contest, that one.
So what you're saying is,
Stupid is misunderstanding. It's probably this forced monogamy thing. That was so dumb. I mean, if you're gonna accuse someone of something, you should accuse them of something that someone somewhere hypothetically believes. And there isn't anyone who believes that the state should intervene and distribute women among useless men. No one has ever proposed that as a solution to anything, except maybe some ISIS recruiters. And so that was the most preposterous example.
And it has not been even invited you back.
No, she hasn't. Well, I'm going back to the UK. It was a month, I think, now. Yeah, it's a month. And, people have got in touch with the Penguin publishers, all sorts of different media people, because I do a lot of media there. But, no, I've never heard from Channel 4 again. But I did reach out to her after that. Well, after the first week, I wrote her and I said, through an intermediary, I said, look, why don't we actually do this again, see if we can actually have a conversation. She said, well, I think I'll wait till it dies down, till the trouble dies down. And maybe it hasn't died down yet. It was a funny situation because, I figured what would happen in that interview is because it was half an hour long, they'd chop it out into like 5 minutes and make it look as bad as they possibly could, like NBC did. NBC did the worst job of anyone so far. That was mind-boggling. It wasn't even so much that it was malicious, although it was unbelievably malicious. It was so amateurish. I thought, what the hell's wrong with you guys? Not only are you being malicious, but you're being stupid. That's a really bad combination. Because they put up the edited version. then they put up the actual video. And so then people on YouTube just said, well, here's how they hacked it. And I thought, I expected more from them, you know. And but anyways, I haven't heard back from Newman, and I don't really expect to. So I think it's the enforced monogamy. That's just being so dumb. Yeah, the misunderstanding that annoys me the most, I think, is I've been accused of failing to distinguish the difference between postmodernism and neo-Marxism. It's like the pseudo-philosophers come and say, doesn't Dr. Peterson know that postmodernism is skeptical of meta-narratives, and that means it's not commensurate with Marxism? It's like, yeah, I know that, but the bloody postmodernists haven't seemed to figure it out. So that's the most annoying one. It's like they're accusing me of ignorance on a philosophical topic when the actual situation is that despite the fact that those doctrines are not commensurate, they're juxtaposed constantly. It's like, that's not my misunderstanding, that's the confusion of the people in academia, so that's the most annoying thing. So, it's not that. So.
Did you ever attend church with Dyson?
No, and I never got invited either. So, well, you know, the thing is that it's unbelievably unwarranted, because he knew nothing about me, so it was just casual shooting off his mouth. You know, like so, I mean, I've had plenty of experience with so-called minority communities. Like, I hate to use that terminology. Not that there aren't minorities, not that there aren't communities, but, you know, he doesn't know a damn thing about me or what I know about people who are in a dispossessed situation. So, you know, he was he had a pretty decent rhetorical gift. He could be charismatic, had a good sense of humor, but a lot of cheap shots, a lot of fuzzy thinking, and a lot of rhetoric. Like when I pushed him on the white privilege thing, it's like, all right, fine, man, define your terms. It's like all he did was act like that was an assault. It's like, no, it's not an assault. I mean, specify your damn terms. All that did was make him irritated. It's like, yeah, I made you think, and now you're irritated. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but the problem with that is that there's a lot of terms in there that need to be defined. What reality is by no means obvious. And people have been arguing about that for, like, technically for, 5,000 years. And there's all sorts of schools of philosophy that dispute, and not only philosophy, but physics as well, that are embroiled in unbelievably deep disputes about exactly what constitutes reality. It's very, very, very complicated. And it's not a matter of obscuring the truth. It's that, well, there's a truth that's associated with how you act. There's a truth that's associated with what the world is made of. Those two truths also have a very difficult time coexisting. No one knows how to bridge that gap. That's the gap between what you want to do and what is. The famous gap that was identified by Hume. These are very, very complicated problems. And if they seem self-evident, the only reason they seem self-evident is because you've adopted one particular philosophical perspective, and that's the one you know, and it seems self-evident. There's like 30 of them, and they fight like mad. So, yeah. Yeah. Well, so you said that when you deconverted that you went through a period of nihilism. Part of the reason for that is that like a materialist atheism doesn't produce an ethic. That's a real problem. That's because there aren't things about materialism. There's lots of things about materialism that are true. You can tell that by the technological power that it grants you if you have a materialist outlook. But the downside of materialism, and there's technical reasons for this, is it doesn't produce an ethic. So
It doesn't provide you with a way of guiding yourself in the world. That's actually a huge problem, because you actually need a way of guiding yourself in the world. So this is part of the problem that I have with Sam Harris, for example, is he tries to conjure an ethic out of his materialistic atheism. It's like, well, good luck with that. It's not obvious how to do that. And that doesn't make me a critic of materialism. I'm a scientist. I know the utility of the materialistic viewpoint, and I'm very much appreciative of the technology that is produced. But bridging that gap to an ethic, that's a big problem. And it's partly, the reason that it's a problem is because science chases ethics out of the argument, technically. Because what you're supposed to do if you're a scientist is to get rid of the value judgments. Well, that's not because they don't exist. It's because they interfere with your description of that which lies beyond value judgments. But there's still the domain of value to contend with. Science can't contend with it. They say, well, it doesn't exist. It's like, no, that's wrong. It's seriously, seriously wrong. It even exists as an empirical phenomenon. We live in a universe of value. We're neurologically adapted to a world of value. So there's serious flaws in that. There's serious flaws in that line of reasoning. And it's hard on people, because if you're purely materialistic in your outlook, and you don't have an ethos, you fall into nihilism. And I would say that's actually proof that there's something wrong with the theory. If the theory makes you hopeless and devoid of purpose, and what lays you bare to the suffering of life with no recourse, then there's something wrong with the theory. At least that's a possibility. And that's what it looks like to me. It's like, this is something else that people have gone after me about with regards to my conversation with Harris. But I think that's mostly because they don't understand what the hell I'm talking about. One of the things Nietzsche said was that truth serves life. That's a definition. It's a definition. You say, well, no, truth is what you extract from an aggregation of material facts. Fine, that's a definition too, but that doesn't mean that definition is a priori correct. Because you're not just a fact-gathering creature. In fact, you're hardly a fact-gathering creature at all. You're something that's striving to live. Well, you need a truth that allows you to strive to live. There's no evidence that the materialistic viewpoint provides that. Well, you say, well, it's complete. It's like, there's no evidence that it's complete. And not only that, it's susceptible to constant revision. It was like 15 years ago we found out that we didn't even know what 95% of the universe was made of. There's plenty of surprises yet to come. So truth, it's a tricky thing, man. It's a tricky thing. It's not self-evident by any stretch of the imagination.
What would your advice be for, I heard you say that you chose not to raise your children in a religious...
Well, I didn't take them to church.
You didn't take them to church?
Yeah.
How do you solve that problem, or what's your advice for people with young children that maybe, like I was raised Catholic, but...
Oh, you should probably take them to church. You say, well, why didn't I? It's like, I don't know exactly. I'd be trying to puzzle it out. I had a friend, this John Compassion that I mentioned, he likes the liturgical ceremonies, and he had me go to one in Seattle, and I had the same reaction to it that I've always had, which was I can hardly wait till this is over so I can get out of there. I think what it was, it doesn't always happen to me, but I think what it is maybe is that I really wasn't a fan of school. I had plenty of it in the years that I was there, and I think that sitting in that context brings that up for me. I was so bored in school that I wanted to gnaw off my fingers. Like, I was seriously bored, and I've had enough of that.
So if you have that same problem, which is similar for me, what would make you think that, especially if you see traits of that in your own kids, is it better to put them through that than
well, I don't know. One of the things, when I look back at my early religious education, because I went to Sunday school until I was 13, I did learn the stories. That's something. I was familiar enough with the stories so they were in my imagination. That turned out to be of unbelievable worth. So I would say, if you don't bring your kids to church, then you have the problem of how in the world they're going to learn the stories. Because church has done a pretty good job of preserving and transmitting those stories. And I think the stories are necessary and useful. So, but I don't have a better solution than that. Yeah, you could.
Teach the stories without the
Well,
dogma or the sermon.
well, you could, but it takes a lot of discipline to do that.
Yeah.
You know, it's often something you might want to parse off to someone else. I mean, maybe you can handle it, maybe you can do it, you can read to them and so on, but it's a major commitment. So, yeah.
So if you had to do it over again, you would just bring it to church even if you couldn't stand it?
I'd like to say yes. You know, they learn most of the stories being in my house because I've dealt with them so much. So maybe I managed that. I'm very ambivalent about that because part of me thinks that I should go, but another part of me hates it. So I'm ambivalent about it. Probably I should go.
You've said that you consider an individual to be a collection of semi-independent motivations. And I was wondering if that scales up to, say, a business with maybe like a board being the equivalent of a consciousness. And then I wondered, might that also scale up to, say, a government? And maybe could the way you conceptualize these rules maybe apply to some of these people wondering what should the principles of maybe self-governance be? Maybe if we figure ourselves out, maybe that scales up.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it scales.
But then the question that brings up is, how does kind of looking inside avoid becoming jingoistic? Right? So like if a government is looking to itself first in order to solve its problems, what separates that? And then that same question scales down. Like, how do you avoid being self-centered when you're focused? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well,
like it becomes obvious when you scale it up that how does it avoid jingoism, and when it scales back down?
I don't think that being self-centered is actually a good solution to the problems that you have. You know, because you might say, as a collection of semi-autonomous spirits, which is certainly a psychoanalytic viewpoint, and I think a biological viewpoint as well. I mean, you are a center of integration, but you're definitely also a collection of semi-autonomous processes. You know, the question is how to bring those into a unity. You might say, well, you do that by adopting a self-centered perspective to bring those into a unity, but the unity isn't self-centered. And I think the reason for that, I kind of outlined that tonight, is that to get those things operating harmoniously together, which is what you do when you socialize a child, they have to be serving the child's interests now, but in a way that doesn't interfere with the child's interests as it propagates across time. And that's an unbelievably tight set of constraints. You see that operating, I didn't talk about this tonight, but you see that operating even in the animal kingdom. You know, when animals organize their hierarchies, they don't organize themselves in a manner that's purely self-serving if they're social animals. And they also organize them in a way that keeps the rights of the other animals in mind as they organize them.
Like the rats.
Yeah, like the rats, or like the wolves, or like the chimpanzees. You know, so that self-centered ethos doesn't even work for animals, much less for us. And I think it's because things have to iterate across time repetitively. And the rules for successful iteration produce very, very tight constraints on behavior in any particular situation. So you get an emergent ethic.
But do you think that scales the same way the bigger you get, like say with a company and with maybe a government? Like,
well, I don't know, because I think things can get so big they just fall over.
Right.
You know, I think that's the lesson of the Tower of Babel. It might even be the lesson of the European Economic Union, is that it's just too, well, it might be the lesson of the United States too, because sometimes I think that about the US. I think it's just too big.
Certainly California.
Well, you think, well, you just think, you know, like it's so big that it isn't clear that it can be governed as a unit.
Right.
You know, like what you do to your presidents is just like brutal. Well, God, it's just too much for one person. It's just too much. And it's 300 million people. You know, it's a big organization. But luckily it's parceled out. Your states have a lot of autonomy. The cities have a lot of autonomy. That's part of the way of addressing that problem, is to make the units more autonomous. Do you have a question?
Me?
No. Oh, sorry.
Me?
No, one
I
more.
did.
Sorry,
There are no questions in this line.
Yes.
Well, I have really been enjoying the way that Paul Baker plays, taking apart every one of your lecture things.
In a good way.
In a good way. I mean, 5 or 6 hours on your Easter message, which is just unbelievable from a person who's deep, gone both ways, the fundamentalist, the atheist, and now you're bringing me back to the Lord at this point.
No.
It's a good thing because I was seeing that nihilism, I was seeing that selfishness and stuff, and he has really brought some really true light into a lot of the things you said from a Christian standpoint. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, what I think about that, what would you say, dipped into a couple of his lectures. What I would say about that is I haven't had enough time to watch them in detail. You know, what I saw, I thought was good. In fact, I think I talked to him as
Yes, you did. You have talked to him. We'll be fine.
Yeah, okay. Did we record it? Do you remember? Was it recorded and put out?
Yes, it was recorded and it was, yes.
Okay. Well, so I would say more power to him. You know, I can't give you any detailed responses to his responses because I don't know what he said well enough to manage that. And you know, my videos are propagating around on YouTube like mad. I can't keep track. There's about 4,000 clips a week being generated. So I'm glad that you found what he's doing helpful.
It is. It's helpful from the standpoint of somebody who is trying to make sense of the way Christianity is being presented today, because there's a lot of friction in that.
Yes.
There's always going to be that friction dynamic, because it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But
it'd be nice if we could make sense of it.
Well, I don't think we ever will, but you know, it's fun trying.
Yeah. So, like I said, some more power to him.
Okay, I'm sorry, we got time for one more.
Okay.
But we already went way over, so you guys got to keep both.
Okay. Yep.
Please regarding Sam Harris.
Yeah.
So first, just to preface, so thankful for all the work you guys are doing. Not only you, and as you said before, like you were just kind of aggregating and illuminating these things. So the one gentleman who asked, hey, this is amazing what you're doing, it's true. But it's also kind of an indicator, I think, other folks hopefully will arise as well because of one of the issues, and they are, and it seems like they are, and it seems like there's this a really special time right now where everybody is kind of here with Ruben and Rogan and Shapiro and Peterson and all this kind of stuff. The one thing, it's kind of, I would say kind of a critique, so, and if I come across too harsh,
It's okay.
I'm very
Fire away, man.
yeah, it's all good. So the one thing I would say is, I find, and I'm sure you picked up on this, you were on Bill Maher's show. Bill, Sam, a lot of the folks in that kind of have that similar kind of maybe atheist way of thinking.
Yeah.
They have a real chip on their shoulder about religion.
Yeah.
Right? So that's fine. To each their own. And hopefully someday that'll snap out. What I've noticed in some of the lectures is, and you said it a little bit here earlier, but not with kind of the tone, let's say.
Yeah.
Some of the times it comes across, I know you're giving lectures and all this and stuff all over the place, but my concern is that it's such an interesting and awesome time that, like, there's a bridge between the right and the left, and a lot of these interesting things, and a lot of rediscovery because there's such a polarization of shared values.
Yeah.
And my concern
So I'm
is,
hoping that happens with Sam, because there's certainly things that we share in common.
Exactly. But like, if some of the folks have probably watched, like, he was on Dave Rubin last couple days and everything like that. And I noticed what I'm concerned about, man, and you can't control him, but you can control yourself as.
Well, you'd hope so.
Well, yeah, it's the best we can, we're all human beings, right? Is like, I would say, be careful. Oh, it sounds like a bit
No, it's okay.
like,
Go ahead.
be careful, like, not to fixate so much on him, but like, just as you said, these are kind of, maybe the presentation is something of your own construction, but the ideas are not. And just like Sam, he's kind of doing some variation of the same.
Yes, definitely.
Right. So it's sometimes I think, and the reason why I say this is important because it's just generally important because I think you guys have an opportunity to really
Yes.
aggregate a lot of people on the right and left, and I think that you're going to get more scrutiny naturally just because of the nature of how folks who are perceived to be conservative are going to be attacked more. So anyway, bottom line, the only thing I would say is, be careful not to. You almost have to be Star Trek reference. Before routing any powered weapons, route every possible piece of energy machines first.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And stay on that vein because sometimes, man, I see you get so passionate. You're like, man, Sam, he believes this up. People don't realize. A lot of times, left-wing people that aren't as discerning, or maybe, but this is that time where let him make a mistake. And try. And I'm not saying throw stones at him. I'm saying be that example to him of like, hey, man, we can do this without throwing.
Yeah, well, we've been communicating, and we're hoping that we won't have an argument, and that neither of us will try to win, and we can have a productive conversation.
I think that's the right way to say it, not try to win.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
That's the absolute